Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently guide you into a quieter part of the past, into a world where shadows lingered behind every candlelit corner, where healing came not in the form of sterile instruments and precise science, but in potions, leeches, and whispered prayers, where pain was a constant companion and hope often rode on the wings of mystery and superstition. So take a deep breath, let the day melt away. Find your most comfortable blanket, let the dim light dance on your walls like torchlight in a stone corridor, and close your eyes if you'd like. Because tonight, we begin a journey, a slow, winding exploration into the dark secrets of medieval medicine. We'll walk beside barber surgeons with crimson aprons, we'll peek into the cramped apothecaries crowded with roots and dried frogs, and we'll listen in on hushed conversations between desperate families and travelling herbalists. Part by part, I will tell you this tale, not in haste but in whispers, soft and steady, a story as strange as it is real, one that may just leave you wondering how anyone survived at all. So now let's begin. The story begins in a place that might feel unfamiliar to us, but was once the very centre of life and death, a medieval village, small, smoke-filled, and wrapped in a silence that spoke of superstition. The year is 1237, though few would mark it with such precision. Here time is told not by clocks, but by bells, and illness like death does not ask for permission. Our story starts with a boy. His name is Ulrich. He was born beneath a harvest moon in the village of Greystone Hollow, a place nestled between two brooding hills and surrounded by dark woods. His birth was not met with celebration. His mother, weak from blood loss, did not speak for 3 days. His father, a local woodcutter with hands like gnarled roots, feared the omen of an owl heard crying near the door the night before. And yet Ulrich lived. He was quiet, his eyes unusually large and bright. Some whispered that he had the knowing stare, an old phrase for children thought to see things others could not. By the time Ulrich was 6, the village knew his name not for mischief, but for silence. He would sit by the stream for hours, watching the water move, touching the reeds, sometimes speaking softly to things only he seemed to see. When an illness took his cousin, a quick, cruel fever that left her body cold by dawn, Ulrich sat beside her that night, saying nothing. The next morning he told his mother that the river spirits had carried her away. It was the kind of thing that earned a child a slap or a whispered prayer or both. But something else happened that morning. The local healer, old Lever, came to the cottage. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her back bent, her voice like dry leaves and her fingers always stained with something green. She smelled of smoke and soil, and the villagers gave her space when she walked past. Some called her a wise woman, others behind closed doors called her a witch. Lever crouched in the doorway, eyes on Ulrich. Then slowly she beckoned him with one crooked finger. He hesitated, but followed. What happened next became the subject of quiet conversation for years to come. Lever took Ulrich under her care. Not as a son, she was too prickly for that, but as an apprentice. She taught him how to listen to the wind, how to read the colour of someone's lips, how to crush willow bark into a pulp that could ease a man's fevered sleep. Her cottage was a cluttered museum of knowledge and bones. Dried flowers hung from the rafters like forgotten prayers, and old books, written in Latin, in Greek, and in symbols no one understood, were stacked beneath the bed, beside the hearth, even under the rug. The people of Greystone Hollow began to change their minds about Ulrich, slowly, hesitantly. When old Lever helped a woman survive childbirth, they thanked her, but when that same woman's baby died a fortnight later, they blamed her. Medicine, in these times, was a delicate dance between hope and suspicion. Healing was not expected, only attempted, and every cure that worked was met with both gratitude and fear. It was through Lever's eyes that Ulrich first learned of the world's darker wounds, not those of the body, but of belief. She told him of humours, the 4 rivers of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, she said, came when these rivers ran wrong. A swollen joint might mean an excess of phlegm, a mood too melancholy, black bile. For these imbalances she had treatments: bleeding, cupping, poultices that stank of garlic and ash. One day Ulrich asked why these things worked. Lever didn't answer. Instead she told him a story. Once, she began, a king fell ill. He called for every healer in the land. Some came with gold tools, some with silver tongues. One came with nothing but mud. Only the mud cured him. Do you know why? Ulrich shook his head. Because the king believed it would. This was a lesson Ulrich would never forget. As the seasons passed, so too did the village change. Greystone Hollow began to face illnesses it could not name. Strange fevers, skin that bubbled and blackened, lungs that filled with fluid. Word came from riders and wanderers that sickness was sweeping the land, something darker than the usual ague, and people began to turn not to the priests nor the local baron, but to old Lever. And by now to Ulrich he had grown taller, his hair dark, his voice low, his hands always stained with ink or earth. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was like sunlight through storm clouds. And though he still spoke little, he saw much. Lever grew slower, her steps more hesitant. She would sleep for longer stretches and forget the names of herbs she had once plucked blindfolded. One morning she took Ulrich's hand and said, "You'll go farther than I ever did, because you'll ask why. I only asked how." That night she died. She was buried beneath the willow tree she had planted herself, wrapped in the same cloak she wore on winter nights, a pouch of dried herbs resting on her chest. Ulrich said no words at the burial. He simply pressed his palm to the earth and walked away. He was 17, and now alone, but not for long. For Ulrich's journey into the darkest parts of medieval medicine had only just begun. And as night falls around us, I hope you'll return tomorrow so I may tell you the next part. Until then, rest easy and dream of stories waiting just beyond the veil of time. The wind carried a strange chill through Greystone Hollow as the year turned. The villagers said it was the breath of winter arriving early. But Ulrich knew better. He had grown sensitive to these changes, not just of weather, but of balance. The birds nested lower, the water in the stream turned cloudy, and in the morning mist he could smell something metallic. Something wrong. In the weeks after Lever's burial, the village shifted its weight awkwardly toward Ulrich. They didn't speak it aloud, but they came, first in trickles, then in quiet clusters. An old man with boils on his back, a child coughing blood, a woman who said she'd lost her dreams and feared they were trapped in her stomach. Each came with their own pain, and each left a piece of it behind in his cottage. Ulrich treated them all, not with the full confidence of his mentor, but with a growing certainty in his hands. He mixed teas of lavender and mint, applied poultices of moss and soot, bled the feverish under the full moon, and tied protective knots over doors using hair, ash, and whispered words. He did what he could, which often was not enough. One of the first to die under his care was a boy named Hal, 8 winters old, pale, silent, with a thin scar across his cheek from some old mischief. He came to Ulrich with a fever that no cold cloth could quell. His breath rattled like wind in brittle leaves, and when his eyes rolled back, Ulrich knew what was coming. Still, he tried. He poured tinctures down the boy's throat. He drew blood. He begged the spirits of water and air for mercy. Nothing helped. Hal died before dawn, and when his mother saw the boy's lifeless form, she did not cry. She turned to Ulrich and spat on the ground. "You're no healer," she hissed. "You're a butcher in robes." That night, Ulrich did not sleep. He sat beneath Lever's willow, candle flickering beside him, and opened one of her oldest books. It was bound in cracked leather, the words inside faded with age and smoke. The language was Latin, mostly, but not entirely. Some symbols he did not recognize. A script that curled and looped like creeping vines. He ran his fingers along the pages and whispered, "Why?" That question, soft and sorrowful, would become a mantra in the weeks to come. When he found nothing in the books that could explain Hal's death, he began to look elsewhere. Beyond Greystone Hollow, beyond even the neighbouring towns, the sicknesses were growing stranger, more sudden. The priests spoke of punishment, of sin, of judgment from on high. But Ulrich knew this was not divine wrath. It was something else, something older, something not yet named. Word came through travelling monks of an abbey to the west, where a new kind of healing was being practiced. They called it scientia, the study of knowledge itself. They spoke not of spirits, but of balance and cause. Ulrich was drawn to it like a moth to flame, so he packed his things, a satchel with herbs, a notebook bound in rough twine, a sharp knife, and one of Lever's worn books. He left the cottage before dawn, leaving behind a note. I will return with better answers. The words were plain, but they carried the weight of a promise. The road was long and unkind. Rain soaked through his cloak. Bandits eyed him in silence, but turned away, perhaps warned off by his dark eyes or the bundle of herbs hanging from his belt. He walked for 9 days, following rivers, listening to the crows, until he reached the Abbey of St. Corvax. It stood on a hill like a stone sentinel, its walls aged and ivy-wrapped, its bells ringing not with joy but with duty. Ulrich was not welcomed. The monks were wary of strangers, especially those who spoke of herbs and humours. But one monk, Brother Anselm, took pity. Anselm was old, with eyes like fogged glass and fingers stained with ink. He had once studied in Salerno, a city famed for its physicians. There, he told Ulrich, the body was treated not as a vessel for punishment, but a puzzle to be understood. Ulrich listened, fascinated. He learned of Galen, the Roman physician whose writings had shaped 1,000 years of thought. Galen believed the humours ruled all, the sanguine, the choleric, the melancholic, the phlegmatic. Ulrich had heard of these before, of course, but now he saw the diagrams, the tools. He read of how to balance them through diet, bloodletting, purging. It all seemed familiar, and yet distant, like hearing an old story told in a new voice. At night, Ulrich would sit by candlelight with the monks and read texts salvaged from older times, some Roman, some Greek, some written by Arab scholars with names like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina. These men had dared to ask why, just as he had. They dissected, they observed, they questioned. It was dangerous thinking. The church tolerated some learning, but not all. There were lines, drawn in ink and fear. One evening, as Ulrich helped Anselm copy a manuscript, he asked, "Why don't we teach these things openly?" The monk looked at him long and slow. "Because knowledge is a blade," he said. "In the wrong hands, it cuts truth away. In the right ones, it opens the body to understanding." But even the right hands are feared. That night, Ulrich dreamt of blades. A silver knife, a body on a table, candlelight flickering on pale skin, and a voice, Lever's voice, whispering, "Ask why." When he woke, the world felt different. He began to experiment, quietly, carefully. In the abbey's small garden, he mixed different herbs, documenting their effects on small animals. He noted which roots numbed the tongue, which berries caused sleep, which leaves brought on retching. Tested his tinctures on himself, small doses at first, then stronger. He recorded everything. He was 17 still, but already the path ahead had shifted. The monks whispered. Some admired him. Others feared him. One accused him of consorting with dark forces after finding a rat cut open in his room. Ulrich was called before the abbot. The abbot was a severe man, with hands that looked better suited for the sword than the psalter. He asked Ulrich one question. "Do you seek truth or power?" Ulrich answered with the truth. "I seek understanding, even if it frightens." The abbot said nothing, but he allowed him to stay. For another year, Ulrich remained within the abbey's stone walls. He learned anatomy from translated texts, studied the stars, the seasons, the way blood flowed faster in heat. He began to doubt some of Lever's teachings, but not her heart. She had done what she could with what she knew, but now it wanted more. He wanted to see the cities, the hospitals, the plague houses, the leper colonies. He wanted to see what sickness really was, up close. So when word came of an outbreak in the port town of Sealmont, he did not hesitate. He packed his satchel again, not with hope this time, but with determination. The dark secrets of medieval medicine, he knew now, would not be uncovered in safety. They would be found in the shadows of suffering, and he was ready to walk into them, alone, if need be. And so, under a sky heavy with ash and rain, Ulrich began the next chapter of his journey, toward sickness, toward truth, toward the heart of darkness itself. The road to Cailmont was not marked by milestones or signs, but by silence. Trees leaned too far over the path, their branches like fingers trying to hold back travellers. The birds no longer sang, and the villages he passed stood quiet, with doors bolted shut and windows sealed from the inside. Some homes bore strange markings painted in ash or blood, circles, crosses, crude figures with outstretched arms. Ulrich recognised them. Protection charms, wards against pestilence, but he also knew their futility. The air grew thicker the closer he came to the sea. It smelled of salt and rot, like fish left too long in the sun. When at last he saw the grey-blue glint of water between the hills, Sealmont rose before him. not proud and bustling as he had once imagined, but gaunt and reeking. Smoke curled upward from chimneys, but it smelled wrong. Not of hearth fires, of burning cloth, of scorched flesh. The city gates stood open, as if the town had given up trying to keep death out. 2 guards slouched beside them, wrapped in cloaks that barely concealed the trembling in their hands. One had a cloth tied over his mouth, stained yellow from breath. The other just stared as Ulrich approached, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "No one in," the masked one croaked. Ulrich reached into his satchel and pulled out a slip of parchment, crudely stamped with the Abbey's seal. "I'm not here for shelter," he said. "I'm here to learn." The guard looked him up and down, saw the herbs tied at his belt, the leather-bound book clutched in his hand. He grunted and stepped aside. "Then may God help you." Inside the walls, Sealmont was not a city. It was a graveyard that hadn't yet caught up with itself. Stalls stood abandoned, their goods spoiling in the open air. Horses wandered without reins, dogs skulked in alleys, ribs showing, eyes gleaming. And everywhere were the bells. Small ones tied around the necks of the infected. Large ones carried by the plague wardens, robed figures who moved slowly through the streets, their faces hidden behind grotesque beaked masks stuffed with lavender and vinegar-soaked rags. Ulrich had read about them. The masks were said to filter bad air, asthma, thought to carry disease. The beaks mimicked birds, symbols of death and messengers of the divine. But now, standing in the thick of it, he realised something more terrible. They wore them not to protect themselves, but to distance themselves, to become less human, less susceptible to sympathy. He wandered the streets for hours before finding a place to rest. A chapel, its doors open, its pews pulled into corners. Inside, cots lined the floor, each bearing a body, some still, some twitching in fever. A nun in a blood-stained habit knelt at the altar, whispering prayers through cracked lips. She looked up as Ulrich entered. "Have you come to bury the dead?" "No," he said softly. "To understand them." She nodded as if that was enough, and in Sealmont it was. Over the next days, Ulrich moved between the dying with quiet determination. He watched the progression of the illness, how it started with chills, moved to swollen glands in the neck and groin, then erupted into dark blotches beneath the skin. The stench was overwhelming. He burned rosemary on his sleeves, dabbed his lips with vinegar. But nothing could keep the sickness entirely at bay. He made notes, careful, detailed notes. He sketched the buboes, large angry swellings, and mapped their spread across the body. He tracked symptoms and timing. Most died within 3 days. Some lingered longer, a few recovered. He asked questions of everyone who would answer. What had they eaten? Who had they touched? Did they smell anything strange before falling ill? Had there been rats? Ah, the rats. They were everywhere. Dead ones in the streets, live ones in the thatch. He caught 3 himself and dissected them behind the chapel, noting the dark lumps beneath their skin, so like the humans. He began to suspect a connection, but no one believed him. The physician in charge of Cailmont's care, a round man with a powdered wig and trembling hands, dismissed Ulrich's questions. "Rats," he scoffed, "are pests, not portents. The air is the culprit. Everyone knows this." But Ulrich wasn't sure. One night he followed a line of plague carts out of the city walls. They moved slowly, the wheels creaking under their load of corpses. The carts were taken to the edge of a field where a vast pit had been dug. There, the bodies were tipped in by the dozen, limbs tangled, eyes staring, mouths open in silent screams. He stood there, unmoving, as the wardens poured lime over the heap and set it ablaze. The fire rose high, crackling like a cruel joke, and the smoke turned the sky black. A voice behind him whispered, "This is mercy." He turned. A woman stood there, cloaked in grey, her face shadowed. "Who are you?" he asked. "A midwife," she replied. "Once." She walked closer. Her eyes were tired, her cheeks hollow, but there was something fierce in her posture, a strength. "I've seen this before," she said. "When I was a child, my village burned from a sickness like this. My mother told me stories of fires, of boils, of men bleeding from the eyes." Ulrich's heart quickened. "Where?" "Far to the south, past the mountains. They called it the Red Death then. Said it came from ships, from silk and spice and shadows." He asked her everything. What she remembered, what her mother had done. She spoke of herbs, wormwood and yarrow, of isolating the sick, of prayers and songs to ward off fear, and of one healer, who said the sickness came not from the stars, but from tiny beasts too small to see. Madness, she said with a bitter smile. But now, I wonder. Ulrich walked her back to her home, a small hut near the docks. She let him borrow a book passed down from her mother. It was crude, with drawings of winged creatures and fevered scribblings, but one passage caught his eye. Beware the blood of the rat, for it carries demons unseen. He didn't sleep that night. He reread the line again and again, and something clicked. He wrote until his hand cramped. Theories, sketches, chains of transmission. It was all still fog, but he was starting to see shapes in it. When dawn came, he rushed to the chapel to share his findings. But the nun was dead. So were 6 of the patients. And on the cot where Ulrich had left his satchel, a single rat lay curled. Its eyes were open, its mouth smiling. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The disease had a face now, and it was watching him. Rain fell over Caillemont for 3 days without pause, as if the sky itself wept for the city. The streets turned to sludge, the alleyways into shallow rivers of filth. The stench thickened, rot, waste, and the acrid bite of burning lime from the plague pits. The bells no longer rang. There were not enough hands left to ring them. Ulrich moved like a shadow through it all, draped in a soaked cloak, his feet wrapped in linen to keep the water from chewing at his skin. He had not eaten in nearly 2 days, save for some stale barley bread he had found in the quarters of a long-dead apothecary. Hunger had become background noise, like the moaning wind. He returned to the woman by the docks, the former midwife. But her home was empty, the windows dark, the door hung ajar. Inside he found only silence and the smell of wet earth. Her book remained, carefully wrapped in cloth, resting on the table as if waiting for him. He took it. Back in the chapel, now nearly abandoned, he laid the book open next to his own. Candlelight flickered across the 2 texts. The woman's heirloom was filled with strange symbols, drawings of winged beasts, serpents with fangs, and men covered in sores. Yet it was not the drawings that held Ulrich's attention, it was the margins, where notes had been scratched in hurried Latin. The eye cannot see the truth. Boil the water, even if the river runs clear. Fleas, the leapers, they pass death from fur to skin. That last note echoed in Ulrich's thoughts. Fleas, he remembered the rats, hundreds, perhaps thousands, their bites, the strange swellings on their bellies. He turned to his own notebook, flipping pages until he reached the diagrams of the buboes on the sick. They were nearly identical, same shape, same darkness beneath the skin, and he remembered a moment, small but sharp, when a sick child had scratched violently at her leg before falling unconscious. He'd assumed it was fever madness, but what if the sickness was passed by something smaller than anyone had ever imagined? Not a spirit, not miasma, but a parasite, an invisible killer. He stood slowly, the chapel swayed in his vision. Hunger pressed against his ribs like a hand. But he had a direction now. The physician still presided over what passed for Caillemont's healing house, a grand name for a converted barn filled with cots and the moans of the dying. Ulrich found him hunched over a table, crumbling dried herbs into a bowl with trembling fingers. "They're not dying from bad air," Ulrich said. The physician looked up, startled. Ulrich dropped a small linen pouch onto the table. It opened, spilling 3 dead fleas onto the wood. "They're dying from these." The physician frowned. "Insects? Fleas?" "Fleas?" Ulrich said. "Carried by rats, I've seen it. I've cut them open. The rats, the humans, the swellings are the same." The physician sneered. "You speak of beasts too small to see. You insult centuries of learning with rat stories and vermin. I insult nothing. I search for truth." The old man rose shakily, pushing the fleas aside with the back of his hand. "You're a boy," he said, "barely grown, and you think yourself wiser than Galen?" "I think Galen never met this sickness." There was a long silence between them. Then the physician spoke again, voice lower. "You risk more than mockery with these ideas. You risk accusations, heresy, witchcraft." Ulrich stared at him. "I risk nothing more than what these people already face, death." And with that he turned and left. He would not return. Instead, Ulrich sought out the parts of the city the healers refused to enter, the underdocks, the fish markets, the hovels stacked too high along the water. Here, the dying were left in bundles, sometimes already swarmed by rats before breath had left them. Here, he found a different kind of knowledge. The poor knew things the physicians did not, They boiled their clothing when they could. They avoided stray dogs and spoke of black spots that appeared before the sickness struck. Some slept with garlic clutched in their palms, not for flavour, but to ward off vermin. It didn't always work, but it showed understanding, a kind of instinct. Ulrich listened and learned. He began mixing vinegar with herbs into a paste, rubbing it along the hems of his cloak and sleeves. He hung dried wormwood and rue around his sleeping area. He crushed juniper into ash and smeared it over doorways. Some thought him mad, but slowly those he treated seemed to fall ill, less off, and those already sick. Some lasted longer. A few even recovered. The whispers began. The young one with the sharp eyes. The rat prophet. Some feared him, yes, but more began to believe. One woman, old and bent with age, brought him a basket of mouldy bread. "For what you did," she said simply. Ulrich took it with thanks. And that night, as he tore off a crust, he noticed something else. Thin green fuzz. He remembered Lever once mentioning bread mould, how it could keep wounds from festering. He'd never thought to test it. He scraped a bit into a small bowl, poured boiled water over it, and set it aside. 2 days later, the water had grown cloudy. The smell was sour, but not putrid. He dabbed it on a rat bite he'd received on his wrist days before. The swelling receded by morning. He added it to his notes. So it went. Observation, failure, theory, test. He built a new language for the sickness. Not one of spirits or divine punishment, but of cause and pattern. Of small horrors too small to name. And still the sickness spread. Even as knowledge bloomed in the dark. One morning, as he stepped from a narrow alley, a carriage rolled past. Black, trimmed with red, guarded by mounted knights in armour dark as pitch. At its helm, a figure in a crimson robe and golden circlet gazed at the city with the indifference of a man surveying a battlefield. The Duke of Caelmont had returned from his inland estate. Ulrich watched as the carriage passed, its wheels spattering filth across the cobblestones. The powerful were returning, which meant the stories would begin to shift. Blame would be assigned. Truth rewritten. He needed to act before that happened. That night he began writing letters, one to the abbey, another to a scholar he'd met on the road weeks before, another to a midwife's guild in the next province. In each he wrote, "There is more to this pestilence than foul air. It lives in rats, it rides on fleas, it enters blood. We must treat not the sky, but the vermin, the walls, the water." He knew not all would believe, but if even one did, it would be enough. And so while Caelmont burned in silence and smoke, Ulrich kept writing, by candlelight, by moonlight, and sometimes by no light at all, only the feverish glimmer of truth and a boy's stubborn belief that knowing might one day save. By the time the rains ceased and the sun dared break through the murky clouds above Caelmont, the city had already begun to devour itself. The worst of the sickness had passed, not because it had been cured, but because there were few left for it to claim. The bells, once a constant chime in the wind, had gone quiet altogether. Those who still lived did so in shadows, behind boarded windows and bolted doors. Ulrich wandered the streets like a ghost. His cloak was frayed at the edges, stained with oil and ash. His eyes, once wide with curiosity, now bore the weary stillness of someone who had seen too much too soon. He no longer counted the dead. He no longer paused when he stepped over a body. He had become part of the city's silence. Yet beneath that silence something stirred. He felt it first in the way the people watched him, not with suspicion now, but with something stranger. Expectation. Hope, perhaps, or desperation's distant cousin. Word had spread, not just among the poor, but among merchants, city guards, even the scribes who kept the records of the dead. They spoke of the young healer who walked unmasked, who bled no fever, who whispered truths no one else dared. They came to him, not with offerings of coin, but of parchment, journals, sketches, recipes, notes from other hands who had tried and failed to grasp the nature of the sickness. A woman brought him a ledger from her dead husband, once a university-trained physician. Another offered a tattered scroll from a travelling Moorish scholar. One man, too weak to speak, pressed a sealed letter into Ulrich's hand with the trembling urgency of confession. Ulrich read it all. Each fragment was a window, some fogged, some shattered, but all part of something larger. A pattern, a voice emerging from chaos. He began to see it. The sickness did not spread evenly. It travelled in veins like fire racing along dry timber. Dense quarters suffered first. then those near the river. Then those who traded, handled cloth, touched coins, passed from merchant to merchant. He traced a map across his wall with charcoal, marking each known case with a red dot. By the time he finished, the pattern was unmistakable. The sickness followed trade, not wind, not sin. Contact, and still, no one listened. The physician who had once dismissed him now avoided him altogether. The nobles had sealed themselves in their manors on the hill. The Duke's men patrolled the city only when necessary, their faces hidden beneath polished masks, swords drawn not for protection but for fear. Ulrich turned his attention to the docks, the heart of Caelmont's trade. Here the disease had first taken root, in the sailors, the dockhands, the fishmongers. He walked the rotting boards with care, speaking to those who remained. Most were gaunt, sickly but alive. They spoke of ships that had arrived weeks before the first outbreak, vessels from the east, one in particular, the Mirabelle, a sleek merchant vessel loaded with silks, spices and dark wood from across the sea. She brought more than cargo, one man said, voice hoarse. Rats! So many rats! I've worked the docks 20 years, never seen so many. Ulrich's breath caught. He asked where the ship had docked. They pointed to the far end of the harbour, now cordoned off, abandoned. The hull of the Mirabelle still bobbed gently against its moorings, tethered and forgotten. He went that night. Under cover of fog, he climbed aboard. The ship groaned beneath him, old ropes creaking in protest. He moved with care, oil lamp in hand, illuminating the once grand interior. Mould curled along the walls. The hold stank of rot and damp. But it was below deck where he found what he feared. Dozens of rat carcasses curled in piles, some bloated, some chewed, some only skeletons. Among the corpses were dark fleas still clinging to fur and flesh. He scooped them carefully into glass jars. Then, searching the captain's quarters, he found a logbook, water-damaged but legible. He read by lamplight, pages curling in his fingers. The captain had recorded illness weeks before reaching Caelmont. Sailors coughing blood, strange swellings. The crew had begged to turn back, but the merchant owner insisted they make port. Profits were promised. The last entry read, "Docked at Caelmont, crew dead or dying. No one came for us. Unloaded the goods ourselves. I can feel the fever now. This ship is cursed." Ulrich took the logbook, the fleas, and returned to the city. By now the sickness had slowed, not because it was gone, but because it had burned so many bridges. There were fewer hosts to leap to, a hollow victory. Yet Ulrich moved with urgency. He transcribed the log, copied his map, wrote everything he had seen, recorded and believed. Then he did something few in the city dared. He requested an audience with the Duke. The answer came after 3 days, a sealed summons. He was led through Caelmont's high gates, past gleaming black armour and suspicious stairs, into a cold hall of marble and firelight, where the Duke sat beneath a painted ceiling depicting saints and battles. The man looked no older than 40. His eyes were sharp, his mouth thin. Ulrich knelt. "You claim knowledge of the sickness," the Duke said, voice even. "I claim observation," Ulrich replied, "and a warning." He presented his findings, the jars, the book, the theories, the map. The Duke listened, did not interrupt. Only once did he glance toward one of his advisors who wore the robes of a church scholar. When Ulrich finished, the hall was silent. The Duke rose, walked slowly to the jars, studied the fleas and said, "If you are right, then what should be done?" Ulrich exhaled, as if releasing years of breath. "Clean the ships, burn the infected cloth, kill the rats, teach people to wash their hands and boil their water. Stop blaming the sky and start watching the ground." The Duke stared at him, then nodded once, dismissed. Ulrich left uncertain, but the next day the harbour was closed. Trade halted, ships scrubbed, barrels of vinegar distributed, and by the week's end, the dead were buried with less haste and more care. He did not stay to be thanked. He had seen enough of Caelmont. He packed his satchel, now heavier with notes, samples and memories. As he walked out of the city, the bells began again. Not for mourning, but for warning. And still, the road stretched on. He would follow it, toward new towns, new plagues, new truths. Because knowledge, real knowledge, was a flickering flame in a dark world. And Ulrich was learning how to carry it. The road beyond Caelmont wound like a ribbon through the valleys of a scarred and weary land. Ulrich walked it with steady steps, the soles of his boots worn nearly smooth, his cloak patched in too many places to count. The weight of the satchel on his shoulder was heavier now, not from burden, but from purpose. The wind had changed, not the wind itself, but what it carried. No longer the suffocating stench of burning death, nor the constant toll of grief. Now, the air whispered of something quieter, a stillness, a pause in the great storm of disease that had swept through the cities like fire through dry brush. But Ulrich did not believe the storm had passed. He knew better. For every silence he had encountered in Selmont, there had been a deeper echo, whispers of sicknesses elsewhere, new forms, new signs, rumours spoken by travellers on the road, by villagers too frightened to look strangers in the eye. Some spoke of a new fever rising in the western provinces, strange, with red rashes and coughing fits that came on suddenly like the lungs had turned against the body. Others spoke of children falling into fits of sleep from which they did not wake, mouths flecked with foam, breath as shallow as dying embers. And so Ulrich walked. He passed through hamlets that barely clung to life. In some, he found children playing in the dust, unknowing of the world's cruelties. In others, he found no one at all, just broken shutters, overturned carts, and the haunting flutter of prayer ribbons tied to doorposts. On the 9th day, he arrived in the village of Eosta's Reach. It was small, tucked between hills thick with moss-covered trees. A stream curled lazily through the centre, its banks dotted with wildflowers. From afar, it looked untouched, peaceful. But as Ulrich approached, he saw the signs. Bundles of herbs hung over every doorway. Not in celebration, but in fear. He passed a group of women kneeling at the edge of the stream, washing linens with an almost desperate vigour. Their hands were red, raw from scrubbing. When they saw him, they stiffened. One reached for a small wooden charm around her neck. "I mean no harm," Ulrich said softly. "Only questions." It was enough to stay their fear. An older woman approached him from the village's edge, her back bent, her hair wrapped in layers of cloth. Her eyes were the only part of her face visible, and they carried a weight that felt older than the hills. "You're the one from Kaelmont," she said. Ulrich blinked. "How do you know that?" "We hear things," she replied. "Travellers, traders. One of our boys was there, said a young man walked among the dead without falling, said he saw you carry a child from the fire pits with your own hands." Ulrich looked down. "I did what I could," he said. The woman nodded, then beckoned. "Come, we have need of one who still listens." She led him through the village, where people watched from behind curtains and cracks in doors. The houses were simple but clean. No piles of waste, no overgrowth. These were careful people, but not unafraid. At the edge of the village stood a longhouse, larger than the rest, its roof sagging slightly at the centre. The door creaked as the woman pushed it open. Inside were 6 cots. On each, a child lay still, their faces flushed, their eyes closed, chests rising, falling, slowly, too slowly. Ulrich stepped closer. He knelt beside one. A girl, no older than 9, her brown hair spread like a fan across the pillow. Her lips were dry, her hands twitching slightly. "When did this begin?" he asked. 3 weeks past," the woman replied. "First it was 1, then 2, then more. Always the children, always at night. Fever, sometimes, other times no, just sleep, as if the spirit is too tired to stay." Ulrich felt the girl's pulse, weak but present. He lifted her eyelid gently, the pupil contracted with light but sluggish. He leaned in, listened to her breath. It rattled faintly like wind through tall grass. He examined the others. All showed similar signs. He turned back to the woman. "Has anyone else, any adults, fallen ill?" "No," she said. "Only the young, and only since the traders came." Ulrich's eyes narrowed. "Traders?" "From the east, cloth merchants. They stayed 2 nights. 8 with us, left on the 3rd day." "And they brought gifts?" "Some cloth," she said. "Silks," they said, "for trade." Bright colours smelled strange. "Where is it?" The woman led him to a locked chest at the back of the longhouse. Inside, folded neatly, lay bolts of deep red and blue cloth embroidered with threads that shimmered even in the dim light. They smelled faintly of spice and something bitter beneath. Ulrich pulled a strip free and held it to his nose. There it was. The same bitterness he'd found in Kaelmont, vinegar, masking rot. He wrapped the cloth carefully and tucked it away. He needed time. Over the next 3 days, Ulrich stayed in Eosta's Reach. He slept little, dividing his hours between studying the sick and testing the cloth. He boiled it, burned a sample, watched how the fumes affected rats he'd captured near the woods. By the 4th day, he had a theory. The cloth had been infested, not visibly, but deep within its folds. Fleas, eggs, carried in the silks like stowaways, and once in contact with the skin, especially thin young skin, the reaction began. Not a full plague, but a sleep sickness, a milder cousin, but dangerous still. He prepared a solution using elderflower, rue, crushed garlic, and a tincture of salt and oil. Applied to the children's skin, it repelled the reaction, stimulated breath. By the 7th day, 2 of the children opened their eyes. By the 9th, 4 more followed. The village rang its bell in thanks, a single note, clear and high, echoing across the valley. But Ulrich didn't smile. He sat beneath a tree, eyes fixed on the horizon, because he now understood something deeper, something colder. The sicknesses were changing, not just spreading, adapting, and not every enemy wore a face. Sometimes it came embroidered in gold, wrapped in silk, waiting. Ulrich left Eosta's reach before dawn, beneath a sky painted with ash-coloured clouds and a moon that lingered a little too long above the horizon. The village elders offered him bread and salted pork, but he took only a flask of river water and a sprig of dried elderflower, pressed into his palm by the oldest of the women, a quiet charm meant to ward off dark spirits. He tucked it into his satchel with care, next to the vial of crushed garlic tincture and a small roll of cloth taken from the cursed shipment. He did not know where he would go next, only that the road continued. The path took him westward, into hills shrouded with mist. Here, the forest thickened and the land rose like a sleeping beast, jagged and slow-moving. There were fewer travellers. The inns, when he found them, were quiet, the innkeepers reluctant to speak. Those who did shared whispers of illness deeper in the mountains. A monastery, one man muttered over a tankard of sour ale. Stone-built, old as sin. The monks don't come down anymore. Ulrich's ears pricked. What illness? He asked. The man shrugged. Something with the mind, they say. Men forgetting their own names, seeing things, laughing at nothing. Another voice, a younger one, added from a nearby table. My cousin worked the fields near there. Said he saw one of the brothers wander into the trees and vanish. Just walked into the mist and never came back. Ulrich said nothing more. He rose at first light and followed the mountain path. It took him 2 days to reach the foothills, where the trees grew blacker and the moss underfoot felt wet even in dry weather. The silence here was heavy. No bird song, no rustle of deer, only wind through broken boughs and the creak of the trees themselves. He reached the monastery on the 3rd day. It stood like a sentinel on the ridge, weathered stone, tall windows like hollow eyes, a single bell tower leaning slightly westward, as if listening to something only it could hear. The iron gates were rusted, the doors shut, but not locked. Ulrich pushed them open, and the sound echoed like thunder in a tomb. Inside he found not silence, but whispers. Low, disjointed voices, not many, perhaps 2 or 3, muttering like wind through leaves. He stepped into the main hall, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone. Dust clung to everything. The smell was strange, not rot, not sickness, but something old, like dried parchment, damp wool, and the faintest trace of burnt wax. At the far end of the hall, beneath a cracked mosaic of a haloed saint, sat a monk, or what remained of one. His robes were frayed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He stared forward, eyes wide and glassy, mouth curved into a gentle smile. He did not blink. Ulrich approached slowly. Brother, he whispered. The monk said nothing, but after a moment he tilted his head just slightly. Do you know where you are? Another long silence. Then, in a voice soft as ash, the monk replied, In the garden. Ulrich frowned. There is no garden here. But the monk only smiled wide-eyeder. Ulrich touched his wrist, pulse present, slow, skin cool. He examined the man further, noting a faint trembling in his fingers. A pattern, a rhythm almost, as though the body still followed some inner music even as the mind wandered. He turned away, only to find a second monk standing in the doorway. Younger. Barefoot, his eyes were closed, yet he walked with eerie precision. I saw the river in the stones, the young monk said. It flows backward now. Ulrich's skin prickled. He followed the younger man as he wandered through the corridors, murmuring to the walls. The monastery was not abandoned, not entirely. He found more monks in the cells and cloisters. Most were still. Some wept. A few rocked back and forth with soft laughter rising in their throats like bubbles. None of them seemed aware of time. Something was very wrong. In the scriptorium, he found signs of frantic activity. pages torn, ink spilled, diagrams half finished. On one table, someone had carved a symbol into the wood, a spiral, over and over, etched so deep the blade had split the grain. He traced it with his finger. On the shelf nearby, he discovered a single surviving ledger. The entries began plainly. Brother Elias reports weakness in the knees. Brother Merek forgets his psalms. Brother Halvin found speaking to birds. Then they speak to someone unseen. The voice in the well calls each night. We sealed the lower levels. That was the last entry. Ulrich descended to the crypt. The stairs spiraled downward in darkness, so complete that even his lantern seemed reluctant to follow. The air turned cold, then colder. The stone walls wept with moisture. At the base of the stairs, he found a rusted grate, twisted open as if forced. Beyond, the crypt yawned like a mouth. Candles long extinguished lined the path, their wicks eaten by time. The floor was uneven, not carved but scratched as though something had been dragged, or something had dragged itself. Ulrich pressed on. He came to a chamber sealed by an iron door. The wood within had rotted. He pushed and it groaned open. Inside, darkness, silence, and then, at the very centre, a well, rope hanging slack. Beside it, scattered pages, a book torn from its spine. He knelt and read. It was a translation, older even than the monastery, of a text believed to be Babylonian in origin. It spoke not of God or saints, but of echoes, thoughts that could infect, ideas that, once heard, could root in the mind and bloom into madness. It was nonsense. Except, he remembered the monk's smile, the spiral, the laughter without joy. He stepped to the edge of the well and looked down. Nothing. But from below, just for a moment, he thought he heard whispers. Ulrich left the crypt at sunrise. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the high chapel and wrote down everything. Not just the symptoms, but the behaviours, the pattern of deterioration. The way each man seemed to lose not just memory, but identity, a sickness of the self. Was it mould? A fungus like that which ruined wheat and brought on madness? A parasite? Or something older, a resonance, a poison of thought? He did not know, but he had seen it, and it frightened him more than any plague of the flesh. For this sickness did not kill the body, it erased the soul. Ulrich did not descend the mountain path in haste. His pace was slow, deliberate, as if he feared the land itself might remember what he had seen in the monastery and pull him back. The trees whispered above him, their branches bare despite the season. The wind no longer stung, but it did not comfort either. It merely watched. He reached the base of the valley by dusk. His eyes stung from sleeplessness, his mind echoing with fragments of speech that had no beginning and no end. The river in the stones, the voice in the well, the backward flowing time. Madness, or something like it. He took shelter that night in a shepherd's hut, long abandoned. Dust coated the corners. A broken cot leaned against the wall, and an old iron lamp sat waiting as though it had always known he would arrive. He lit it, then unrolled the parchment he had filled in the monastery's chapel. His handwriting had grown slanted, cramped, as if the sickness of the place had leaked into the ink. But the words still made sense. The symptoms were consistent. Disorientation, repetition of speech, fixation on patterns. He underlined the spiral drawing he had copied from the carved desk. Delirium without fever, he had noted. Euphoria, hallucination, rhythmic behaviour. He had seen something like it once before, years ago, in a village far from Greystone Hollow. A man had consumed bread made from spoiled rye. The villagers said he danced for 2 days before collapsing. At the time, Ulrich had dismissed it as rumour. Now he wasn't so sure. The monastery illness might be physical or it might not. There was precedent, though poorly understood, for sickness born of what could not be seen. Tiny things, mould and rot and air thick with invisible spores. What if the infection was not in the body, but in the breath, in the stone, or in the words themselves? He wrote cautiously that night, each sentence more careful than the last, as if one wrong word might unlock something best left sleeping. In the morning he burned a portion of the parchment, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. There were things he had written in the depths of that mountain that he could no longer remember writing. Fragments of a language he didn't know, names that did not belong to any saint or scholar. It was better that they were ash. He made for the river next, following its slow and steady crawl westward. Towns here were few, separated by long stretches of wild land. For days, Ulrich saw no one but deer and carrion birds. He took comfort in the simplicity of it, in hunger, in weather. These were truths he could still hold. Eventually, he came to the village of Talden Ford. It was a place barely marked on any map, a cluster of cottages near a bend in the river, with a single wooden bridge that arched like a spine over the water. The people here were suspicious of strangers, but not unkind. They watched Ulrich with quiet eyes, speaking little, but offering bread and boiled roots without asking questions. He stayed 3 nights, and it was on the 2nd that the dreams began. They were not nightmares in the traditional sense. There were no screams, no chases through shadowed corridors. Instead, they were quiet. Too quiet. He found himself standing in empty rooms with voices just beyond the walls. He dreamed of stone halls and endless spirals, of monks with blank faces, and always the well. By the 3rd night, he stopped sleeping. Instead, he wandered the riverbanks beneath the moonlight, hoping the cold would still his thoughts. It didn't. A local girl found him there one morning, sitting beneath the bridge, eyes open but distant. "You look like you've seen the dead," she said. Ulrich turned to her slowly. She could not have been more than 12. "I have," he said. "Did they speak to you?" "No," he replied after a moment, "but I think I listened anyway." The girl didn't seem afraid. She sat beside him and offered half an apple already bitten. He took it with a faint smile. "They say the river here is cursed," she said after a while. Ulrich looked at the water. It flowed steadily, its surface glassy and brown. "Why?" "Because it forgets," she said. "It washes things away, sometimes people too." He didn't respond. But later that day, he tested the water, drew samples, heated it in his small kettle, filtered it through cloth and ash. He found nothing unusual, no mould, no scent of rot. But the dreams didn't stop. On his final morning in Talden Ford, he visited the village's small chapel. It was made of stone and wood, half swallowed by ivy, the interior lit only by narrow windows. The priest was a tired man with a voice like dry paper. When Ulrich asked about illness, the priest shook his head. "We are not plagued here," he said, "but we are watched." "By what?" The priest gestured toward the river. "By what came before." Ulrich's breath caught. "You've had sickness here," the priest nodded. "Years ago, a different fever, not of the body, but of the soul. We lost many, not to death, but to forgetting. They wandered into the woods. Some came back speaking strange things, some never came back at all." "Do you remember what started it?" The priest was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "They found a book." Ulrich felt a chill rise from his spine. The priest continued, "Washed up by the river, in a wooden box, wrapped in seals and iron rings, bound in black leather. They said it smelled of ash and salt. What happened to it?" "We burned it," the priest said. 3 days of fire. The smoke was thick as wool, but the words lingered. Ulrich left Talden Ford that evening. He did not take the river path again. Instead, he followed the old forest road where moss grew thick and the trees leaned in, whispering among themselves. He needed time to think, time to forget. But some things do not leave so easily, especially the things that speak without sound, especially the dark. The old forest road narrowed with every mile, hemmed in by ancient oaks whose branches reached overhead like skeletal arms, blotting out the sky. The earth beneath Ulrich's boots was soft, yielding with rot and thick layers of fallen leaves. The silence here was different from the stillness in Kaelmont or the quiet of the monastery. This was an older hush, one that seemed to predate language. Even the birds, if they lived here at all, did not sing. Ulrich pressed onward. The satchel at his side was heavier now, filled with his writings, samples, and the burden of questions with no clear answers. He had spent nights under open skies and hidden among gnarled roots, but he did not rest. He could not. The dreams still followed him, soft, spiralling visions of whispering voices and forgotten words. But something else had begun as well. Waking moments where his surroundings seemed to shift, a path that curved differently than before. A stone he could swear had not been there yesterday, a moment where the trees swayed with no wind. He told himself it was exhaustion. He told himself many things. It was late on the 3rd day that the forest broke. The trees fell away to reveal a narrow vale nestled in the crook of 2 hills. A single cottage stood there, built of stone and peat, with a thin trail of smoke rising from its crooked chimney. Ulrich approached slowly. The air here was clean, fragrant, no rot, no sickness. A woman stood outside, gathering herbs from a raised trough. She was old, older than anyone he had seen since Lever. Her face was creased with time, but her eyes were sharp as frost. She watched him approach, but did not speak until he stopped a few paces away. "You bring many ghosts, boy," she said. Ulrich stiffened. "Do they speak to you, too?" She smiled faintly. "Not anymore. I learned to hush them. You haven't yet." He lowered his eyes. "I'm looking for answers." "Then you've come too late," she replied. "Or far too early. Come. You're hungry." Inside the cottage, the air was warm. Shelves lined every wall, filled with bottles, dried flowers, old stones, and objects Ulrich could not name. A single bed occupied one corner. A heavy wooden table took the centre. A kettle steamed over a fire that smelled of juniper and sage. She served him broth, thick, earthy, tinged with something bitter that reminded him faintly of yarrow. He ate in silence, watching her move with practiced ease. "I've seen the sick," he said at last. "All kinds, flesh, blood, mind. But there's something else moving through the world now, something deeper." She nodded. "It has always been there," she said. "You're just learning how to see it." "What is it?" She did not answer at once. Instead, she reached for a bundle of thin bark strips soaked in something dark. She unrolled one carefully and laid it on the table. The writing was strange. Not like Latin or Greek, not even like the spiral marks he had seen before. "These were taken from the root of a dead tree," she said, "a tree that grew over a forgotten burial mound. The bark remembers." Ulrich leaned in. The script seemed to shift as he looked at it, twisting, adjusting, as though aware it was being read. He pulled back. The woman gave a slow nod. "Most who look cannot see. Some see too much." "I saw something in a monastery," he whispered. "It wasn't illness. It was an echo. A sickness of thought. Of knowing." She turned back to her kettle. "Knowledge has always carried sickness. Some truths are too large for the mind. They do not fit cleanly. They tear as they settle." Ulrich's breath slowed. "I need to understand it." "You already do," she said, "but you're still hoping there's a cure." He was silent. She continued, her voice like the wind in tall grass. "Long ago, healers believed that naming a thing gave you power over it. They thought if you knew a fever's true name, you could burn it out. But some names burn you instead." She gestured to the fire. "There is a story, one I will tell, and no more." He nodded. She sat opposite him and began, not with a preamble, but as if she were remembering. "There was once a village, lost now. They spoke no common tongue. Their healers wrote in fire-charred ink on bone, and one day a child fell ill. He did not scream, he did not fever. He simply stopped speaking, then stopped blinking, then stopped being." Ulrich barely breathed. "The village elders opened the boy's skull," she continued. "They found no worms, no tumour, no rot, but in the hollows of his mind were symbols, etched like language into the tissue, as if a story had written itself inside him. No one could read it, but those who looked too long," she paused, "forgot who they were." Ulrich swallowed hard. "What happened to the village?" She gave a small smile. "You know the answer." "Gone, like so many others." He leaned back, heart heavy. "So what now? What do I do with this knowledge?" "Carry it," she said, but lightly. He stayed one more night. The dreams did not come. Instead, he dreamt of silence. A pure, deep silence, not fearful but ancient, the kind that comes before speech. When he woke, the woman was gone. So was the cottage. He stood alone in a meadow, mist curling around his ankles, the sun bleeding through the treetops in threads of gold. Only one thing remained, a single strip of bark in his satchel. Ulrich did not read it, but he kept it and began walking once more. Ulrich walked for 3 days without direction. The forest behind him closed like a dream forgotten upon waking, and the mountains had long vanished from sight. He followed no path, only instinct. A pull in his chest that led him across open plains, through quiet gullies where mist clung low and dew painted silver across spider silk. The bark strip from the old woman's cottage rested at the bottom of his satchel. Though he had not read it, he felt its weight, a silent hum of presence that seemed to murmur at the edges of thought. He had begun to wonder if it spoke in dreams, or if dreams themselves were now something else entirely. On the 4th morning, Ulrich came to a town with walls. Not high, not grand, timber and stone set in a hasty circle, more for show than defence. It was called Fairholt, though the name carried no joy. The guards at the gate were young, their spears crooked, their armour mismatched. When they saw him, they did not challenge, only watched, tired eyes flicking toward the satchel, toward the way he walked, the way he saw everything. They let him pass with a nod. Fairholt was not dying, but it was holding its breath. The market square was open, yet sparse, stalls half-filled, merchants whispering, coin exchanged like secrets. Children played, but their laughter was restrained, as if even innocence feared to echo. And above it all stood the bell tower, silent, though ropes still hung in readiness. Ulrich found lodging in a small tavern. The keeper said little, only asked if he needed food, and if he had been to the south. "I've been to many places," Ulrich replied. The man nodded and gave him a room with a straw-stuffed mattress and a window facing the alley. That night, Ulrich wrote. Pages and pages. Not just of symptoms, not just of theories, but of patterns. The way each illness, no matter how different, moved in circles. It began in whispers, then signs, then belief, then surrender. In the morning, he went to the chapel. It was stone-built, narrow and cold. Inside, he met a woman not dressed as a priest, but clearly the keeper of prayers, her robe simple, her face lined, her hair bound in grey ribbon. She was lighting candles when he entered. "Are you here to confess?" she asked, not unkindly. "I'm here to understand." She looked at him, pausing with the taper still in hand. "You're the one who asked about the bell," she said. "The innkeeper told me." "I've seen sickness," Ulrich said. "Enough to know when it's coming." She set the taper down. "Then you know what the bells mean." He nodded. She motioned for him to sit. They spoke for hours. Fairholt had not yet been struck, but something moved in the hills to the south, beyond the fields where no one now tended crops. The livestock refused to stay penned. Crows gathered in the trees and did not scatter. There were stories of people found standing in their homes long after death, their eyes wide, mouths full of black soil. The woman, Sister Thale, had sent messengers to the abbey 2 weeks ago. No reply had come. "Some here say it's a punishment," she said. "Others say it's a curse carried by air, or sin." "It's none of those," Ulrich said gently, "but it is something." He spent the next day speaking to those who would answer. A miller, who claimed his grain had turned foul overnight. A baker whose wife no longer remembered his name. A shepherd whose sheep had vanished, only to return days later, skinned but alive. Ulrich took notes, tasted the water, examined the bread, studied the air. Everything looked normal. But he had learned that appearances were rarely allies. That evening, a boy came to the tavern, no older than 10. He handed Ulrich a small bundle and said only, "From my grandfather." Inside was a folded cloth, and within it, a tooth. Human, blackened, yet unrotted, smooth. Ulrich turned it in the firelight and saw something carved into its base, a spiral. His breath caught. He asked where the grandfather was. The boy hesitated. He doesn't speak now, just hums all day. Looks at the trees. Ulrich rose at once. The boy led him to the edge of the village, where a cottage leaned against a copse of elms. Inside, the old man sat in a chair by the window, facing outward. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes were open, and he was humming. Not a melody, but a tone. A long, droning note that pulsed through the air like pressure. Ulrich stepped closer and saw that the man's mouth was packed with soft black soil, not enough to choke, but enough to stain his teeth. On his chest rested a book, bound in cloth, tied in twine. Ulrich reached for it. The man did not stop humming. He opened it slowly. Inside were pages filled with symbols. Not the bark script, not Latin, something else, jagged, interlocking, symmetrical. Some pages were covered corner to corner. Others bore a single line. He felt the hairs on his arms rise. Something about the ink shimmered. He closed the book and left. Back at the tavern, he placed the book beside the strip of bark in his satchel. The two did not touch, but it felt as if they noticed one another. He barely slept that night. When he did, he dreamed of the chapel bell, ringing, though no one pulled the rope, ringing over and over, its sound deep and slow and endless. When he woke, his ears were ringing too. It stopped as soon as he sat up. The book and the bark were still beside each other, but one page had turned. Ulrich did not remember doing so. He didn't read it, but the word on the page looked back. Ulrich left the tavern before the sun had risen. Fairholt still slept, the streets blanketed in fog, rooftops etched in frost. He moved silently, his satchel heavy against his shoulder, the weight of the book and the bark pressing against one another like two magnets drawn from opposite worlds. He did not dare look at either. Not yet. He walked to the chapel. Sister Thale was already awake, lighting incense in the dark. The scent of cedar and myrrh coiled around the pillars like smoke from a dying fire. "You feel it too," she said without turning. Ulrich nodded. "There's something in this place," he murmured, "but not in the earth, not in the air. In minds. It spreads like illness, but it's not of the body." Thal turned to him then. Her face was drawn, the skin under her eyes shadowed. "You're not the first to say that," she whispered, "but the others, they don't last." She motioned toward the rear of the chapel. Behind a curtain lay a small chamber, once used for rest and reflection. Inside now were 3 cots, each occupied by a villager. Their eyes were open, mouths slightly parted, breath steady but shallow. "They're not sleeping," Thale said, "but they are not here." Ulrich approached the first, a woman in her middle years. Her hands were folded, her skin warm, but her gaze was fixed on the ceiling, as if waiting for something. "Do they speak?" Thale shook her head. "Only once, the night they fell ill." "What did they say?" She hesitated. Then, "They said a name, the same one." Ulrich waited. Thale's voice dropped to a breath. "Velmir." The name coiled in the air like smoke. He had never heard it before, yet it felt familiar, like a scent from childhood, like a song half remembered. It made the room colder. He touched the woman's wrist. Her pulse flickered beneath the skin, alive, but something was gone. "I think they saw something," he said. Thale didn't reply. Instead, she reached into a drawer beneath the cots and withdrew a folded cloth. She handed it to Ulrich. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of parchment, a drawing, circular, intricate, a spiral within a spiral, flanked by glyphs, jagged, angular. At the centre, a single eye. "They drew this?" he asked, all 3, separately. The parchment trembled in his hands, though the air was still. He recognised the glyphs. They matched the book. Ulrich returned to his room. He unwrapped the book and laid it beside the bark strip, then added the parchment drawing. He lit 3 candles, set them in a triangle around the table, and sat down. He had seen plague, fever, madness, suffering beyond count, but nothing had ever made him hesitate like this. Still, he opened the book, not to read, not fully, just to look. He flipped to the page that had turned on its own. The symbol there was almost identical to the one drawn by the villagers, but beneath it a line of text, written in clean black ink. It hadn't been there before. "He is remembered by those who forget." Ulrich stared. He did not write this. Of that he was certain. He checked his hands. No ink stains, no memory lapse, but the words were real, and somehow not for him. He turned the page again. Blank. Another symbol of more writing. He waits between pulses of thought, in the gaps of dreaming. He closed the book. Outside, the bell began to ring. He rushed to the window. In the square below, Sister Thale stood with the rope in her hand, her eyes wide, her face pale. The sound was uneven, each toll slower than the last. People emerged from their homes, faces tight with fear. The bell had not rung in years. A boy cried out from the east gate. "They're coming!" Ulrich moved before his thoughts caught up. He ran to the gate. A small group approached. 5 in total. They stumbled down the road like drunkards, robes torn, feet bare. Monks, but not from Fairholt. He recognised the colours, crimson and ash. They were from the mountain monastery. He reached them as the guards hesitated, weapons raised but unused. The monks collapsed to the ground. Only one remained upright, a tall, gaunt man whose eyes burned with something Ulrich couldn't name. "Help them," Ulrich said, but the tall monk lifted a trembling hand. "Don't touch!" He rasped. Ulrich froze. The monk's lips cracked as he spoke again. "He is awake." Ulrich stepped back. "Who?" The monk's gaze turned skyward. "Velmir," he whispered. "The one buried in words, the one whose name is a path." Then he fell, dead before he hit the ground. The others did not stir, but on each of their foreheads a mark had been carved, a spiral, burned into flesh. The villagers began to murmur. Fear crackled through the air like lightning on dry grass. Ulrich looked to the woods beyond the gate. There was no movement, but he felt it. Something watching, something old. And in his satchel, the book grew warm. The spiral burned itself into Ulrich's memory, etched not just in vision, but in sensation. He could feel it even when he closed his eyes, a slow turning behind his thoughts. The villagers had drawn back from the bodies, whispering prayers through clenched teeth, crossing themselves in ways both sacred and panicked. Sister Thale stood at the edge of the square, her hands clasped before her, trembling slightly. Ulrich knelt beside the tall monk's corpse. The spiral had been burned into the flesh with precision, not sloppily, not as a symbol of punishment or suffering. It was ritualistic, a seal perhaps, or a key. He dared not touch the man directly, but he leaned close enough to notice the scent. Charcoal, vinegar, and something else. Something metallic, like scorched iron. The other monks had died in silence. Their bodies bore no signs of trauma, no wounds, no blood. Yet their expressions told a story Ulrich had no words for. Their mouths were slightly open, their eyes glassy and wide. Each face mirrored the others in a kind of frozen awe or horror. He whispered to no one in particular, "What did you see?" But of course they would not answer. By dusk, the townsfolk had buried the monks beyond the eastern field. Sister Thale performed the rites, though her voice faltered more than once. No hymns were sung, no bells were rung. Ulrich returned to his room. He did not light the candles this time. Instead, he opened the shutters, letting the cold air slip in, hoping the chill might wake him from whatever web he was caught in. On the table lay the book, the bark strip, the spiral drawing, and now, a new addition, a cloth scrap taken from the tall monk's robe. He had found it clenched in the man's fist, the fabric damp with sweat. Symbols had been inked onto it, hastily in smudged black. Ulrich hadn't translated them, but he had counted them. 7 characters, repeated 7 times. In the margin of his notes he wrote, 7 spirals, 7 steps, 7 names. He stared at the book for a long time, then did what he had been avoiding for days. He opened the bark strip. The symbols there were clearer now, as if the passage of time or his own slow descent into understanding had unlocked something. He recognized the structure, radial symmetry, echoed glyphs, directional flow. It was not meant to be read like words, but experienced. He placed it beside the cloth scrap. The patterns aligned, imperfectly but deliberately, like pieces of a map drawn by different hands. The phrase from the book echoed in his memory. He is remembered by those who forget. Velmir. The name was not just a label, it was an invitation, a doorway. Ulrich did not sleep that night. He sat by the open window, listening to the wind pass through the alley like breath through hollow lungs. Somewhere far off he thought he heard humming. By morning the sickness had begun. 2 villagers, a young man and an older woman, had been found in their beds, alive but unresponsive. Their bodies still breathed, but their minds had unravelled. Both stared at the ceiling, mouths open, lips blackened as if kissed by soot. On each of their palms someone had drawn spirals in ash, but no one knew who. Ulrich examined them closely. Their pulses were slow, irregular. They murmured occasionally, single syllables, not language. When he leaned in, he thought he heard one of them whisper, "Vel!" But the sound melted into silence. He spoke to Sister Thale in the chapel. "This isn't a plague," he said, "not in the way we understand it." "Then what is it?" she asked. "An infection," he said, "but not of the blood." He paused, choosing his words. "It's an infection of attention, of knowledge. It spreads through ideas, symbols, memory, names." Thale shivered. "Then we're already lost." Ulrich shook his head. "Not yet. If it can spread, it can be traced, contained, maybe even broken. By burning books?" she asked bitterly. "No," he said, "by understanding them." He returned to his room and lit the candles again. The book opened easily now, as if it knew his touch. He read more. Most pages were still incomprehensible, jagged symbols, impossibly intricate spirals, diagrams that seemed to shift when he blinked. But between the madness there were fragments of clarity. He was not born, he was written. He lies beneath language, a seed beneath the tongue. Those who name him open the gate, those who hear it twice step through. Ulrich stopped there. He closed the book gently and wrote in his own journal, "The sickness is not a sickness. It is a story, one too large to carry, too sharp to hold. It reshapes the mind that holds it." That evening, a child went missing, a boy of 8. Last seen drawing circles in the dust with a stick. They found him just before nightfall, asleep in the shadow of the chapel. His hands were clean, but beside him lay a perfect spiral drawn with remarkable precision. Too perfect for a child. Ulrich knew then it was accelerating. The story was telling itself, with or without him. He just hadn't yet reached the chapter where he was no longer the reader. But the reed. The boy did not wake. They carried him gently into the chapel. laid him on a pallet beside the others who had fallen under the same spell, wide eyes, parted lips, breath slow and mechanical. Ulrich knelt beside him, hand pressed to the boy's forehead, warm but not fevered, no sign of pain, no tension in the limbs. The body was alive, the self, absent. Sister Thale hovered near the threshold, her hands stained from drawing protective circles in chalk around the boy's resting place. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Is it sleep or surrender? Ulrich didn't answer. He had begun to understand something far more terrifying than disease or even madness. This affliction, this presence, did not need to destroy the body. It simply hollowed out the mind, like a candle burned from within, leaving only the outer shape behind. It was not taking life. It was that night, Ulrich returned to his room and bolted the door behind him. He cleared the table and arranged the artifacts once more. The book, the bark, the cloth scrap, and now the drawing the boy had made in the dust, carefully redrawn by Ulrich before the wind could claim it. 4 spirals now, each subtly different, each bearing the same echo. He lit 5 candles this time, 1 at each corner, 1 at the centre, and he began to read, not aloud, not even in full. He traced the symbols, letting them guide his thought, not as words, but as rhythms. Patterns that bypassed language and burrowed deeper into instinct. The book was not meant to be read with the eyes, it was meant to be felt. He didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes, hours, time bent around the pages. Then something shifted. The shadows in the room lengthened, though the flames of the candles burned steady. A faint scent filled the air, salt and cedar, and something burnt. The symbols on the bark seemed to ripple, and the spiral on the parchment began to blur as if wet. A pressure formed behind his eyes. A single line of text bloomed at the top of the book's open page. The 5th spiral is recognition, and beneath it, to know him is to name him. To name him is to bind him, but only once. Ulrich blinked. The words were gone, replaced by symbols again, shifting, turning inward. He stood too quickly. The world swayed, his stomach twisted. He barely made it to the basin before vomiting water and bile. When the fit passed, he collapsed beside the hearth, chest heaving. The candlelight flickered gently, uncaring. The book lay open, still, waiting. He slept without knowing, and he dreamed, but not of the monastery, not of spirals, not even of Velma. He dreamed of himself. He was walking through a library so vast the ceiling was lost in fog, the shelves endless. Every book bore his name. Every title was a moment from his life, some real, some yet to come. He passed one that read, "The Day He Chose Not to Flee." Another, "The One Who Looked Too Long." He stopped before a book bound in bark. Its title, Ulrich's Last Page. He reached for it. A voice, soft, ancient, whispered behind him, "Don't." He turned. No one was there. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat. It was morning. Someone was banging on his door. He opened it to find Thale, breathless, pale. "Another," she said. A traveller. From the east, he was found in the square, drawing in blood. Ulrich followed her through the village. The townsfolk had gathered in a wide circle, staring in silence. At the centre, the man knelt, naked to the waist, back carved with spirals, fresh, bleeding. He gripped a stick in his trembling hands and continued to draw on the stone with his own blood, lips moving wordlessly. Ulrich approached. The man looked up. His eyes were solid black, no iris, no white, only void, and he smiled. Ulrich knelt. "What is your name?" he asked. The man's smile widened. "I am the gate," he said. "I am the wound through which he dreams." Ulrich felt the world tilt. He forced himself to stay calm. "Who is he?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper, though it carried through the crowd like thunder in bone. "You already know." Then he collapsed. Dead. But his body did not fall limp. It knelt perfectly still, spine straight, eyes open, waiting. That night, the wind changed. It came from the east, thick with the scent of dust and old fires. Ulrich could not sleep. He sat before the fire, hands trembling, the book open on his knees. No new words appeared, only the spiral, slowly turning, slowly watching. He whispered to no one in particular, "What are you?" And from the hearth, the flames pulsed once, then bent just slightly toward the book, as if answering, as if bowing. The next morning, the wind did not stop. It moaned through the alleys of Fairholt like a mourning voice, low and constant. Curtains billowed despite windows being shut. Doors creaked on their hinges even when barred. Animals were restless. Birds flew in circles, refusing to leave the steeples. and at dawn the bell atop the chapel rang once, without a hand to pull the rope. The village began to fray. Ulrich moved through the square with his hood drawn low. Whispers followed him like a shadow. Some still called him a healer, others now called him something else. The book had not left his side in 2 days. The spiral drawing had multiplied. More children had begun scrawling them in the dirt. One was found carving it into the wooden side of the chapel with a bone. When asked why, she replied only, "He told me to." That child was now silent, not asleep, not catatonic, but mute, staring always toward the east. The horizon had taken on a faint reddish hue. Sister Thal met Ulrich in the chapel under candlelight. Her hands were shaking. "They want me to burn the chapel," she said. He turned to her slowly. "Why?" "They think it's where it started. The first sleepwalker, the boy, the spirals. They say the walls are whispering." "They're not wrong," Ulrich said softly. She looked at him, eyes hollow. "I don't know what we're fighting anymore." Ulrich placed the cloth scrap on the altar. "I'm beginning to think we're not fighting." She didn't respond. That night, Ulrich gathered what few brave enough still listened. Sister Thale, 2 former soldiers, and a scribe from the village records hall. He told them what he knew, what he suspected, that the spiral wasn't just a mark, but a method, that it wasn't just spreading by sight or sound, but by memory. "It enters through thought," he explained, his voice low. "And once it finds a place to settle, it blooms. Like fungus, it doesn't need to be understood, just seen, or worse, believed." One of the soldiers spat. "You're saying an idea is killing us?" "No," Ulrich said. "I'm saying an idea is rewriting us." He took the bark strip, the cloth scrap, and the child's drawing. He laid them side by side. They all align, in structure, in sequence. They're instructions, not for building, not for summoning, but for hosting. The scribe leaned forward. "For what?" Ulrich hesitated. "I don't know. I'm afraid it's not a thing. It's not even a being. It's a presence." Thale whispered, "Velmir." The name echoed in the room like an echo underwater. Ulrich didn't flinch this time. He simply nodded. The others were silent for a long while. Then the soldier spoke again, softer this time. "Then what do we do?" Ulrich reached into his satchel and drew out the book. "I need to find the last page. He is remembered by those who forget. He waits between pulses of thought. The 5th spiral is recognition. But there were 7 spirals, and that meant 2 remained. He believed now, truly believed, that if he read far enough, if he understood enough, he might reach the centre, the truth, or the origin, perhaps even the cure. But it would come at a cost. He felt it already. The dreams, the shifting shapes at the edges of vision, the moments where he no longer remembered how long he'd been staring at the same page, the odd stillness in his hands, as if they no longer fully belonged to him. But still, he turned the page. That night he saw the 6th spiral. It was not drawn, it was not inked. It revealed itself slowly in the wood grain of the chapel's floor, in the arrangement of fallen leaves against the wall, in the way the shadows of the candlelight flickered against the beams. It was everywhere. It had always been. The 6th spiral is reflection. That's what the book whispered, just once. In a script made of light and shadow, he wrote it down, though his hand moved without his bidding. The 6th spiral is reflection. He sees you through it. He learns you. He begins to speak in your voice. He woke with his head on the altar, the book still open. Thale found him there, pale, shaking, lips whispering in rhythm. She placed a cloth over him, weeping quietly. He no longer remembered when he last ate. He no longer remembered the faces of the villagers. Only the spirals. And the voice that spoke not to him, but as him, somewhere deep in the echo chamber of his mind. Velmir was not coming. Velmir was remembering, and Ulrich was being remembered. The days that followed in Fairholt were like pages turning themselves. Time no longer moved in a straight line. It looped, spiraled. Morning light came too quickly, or too late. Shadows fell in odd directions. Bells rang though no hand pulled the rope. Ulrich barely noticed anymore. He moved through the village with the slow certainty of someone no longer asking questions. He spoke softly, his voice even and calm, though he rarely blinked. His hands, once trembling, were now still. The villagers who once approached him for healing now watched from doorways, whispering to one another in dread. They called him touched, they called him marked, and quietly they began to leave. Families packed by night, walking west with only what they could carry. By the 5th day, half the homes stood empty. The air in Fairholt became thick with abandonment, a hush that settled into the bones of the village. But still Ulrich remained, and he read. The book had changed, or perhaps it was changing him. The pages now turned without his hand. Symbols shifted beneath his gaze, becoming letters, then images, then things he could feel, not on his skin, but in the pit of his being. And always, the spirals, growing in complexity, curving into themselves in ways that made the eye ache and the soul recoil. He no longer slept. He dreamed awake. One evening, he returned to the chapel and found Sister Thale sitting on the floor before the altar, her back to him. A small candle burned at her side. He approached slowly. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. "I didn't make a sound," he replied. She turned her head slightly. "More have left." "I know. Do you think they're safer?" "No," she exhaled. "Then why don't you stop?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped beside her and laid the book at the foot of the altar. "I saw the 6th spiral." Thale's voice was quiet. "And the 7th?" He looked up at the crucifix above the altar. It had begun to crack. Not visibly, but subtly, like the wood no longer held itself together. "The 7th spiral," he said, "is entry." Thale turned to him. "You said it was a presence." "It is. Then what does it enter?" Ulrich looked at her, his eyes bloodshot, his voice hollow. "Us." There was silence between them. Then she whispered, "How much of you is still you, Ulrich?" He didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. That night he stood in the chapel alone. He placed the bark strip in a basin and lit it. The smoke rose in a perfect coil. He drew the spirals, all 6, in ash along the floor, aligning them with the cardinal points, with the chapel's geometry, with the symbols etched into the book. Every motion was deliberate. Every step followed the rhythm the book had taught him. When it was done, he stood at the centre and waited. The air shifted, not in a breeze, but in a pull. The flames of the candles bent inward toward him. The shadows flattened. And for a single breathless moment the chapel held something more than stone and silence. Recognition. He saw it in his mind. A figure, not a man, not a beast, not a god, but a shape made of memory, a presence composed entirely of what had been forgotten. Its form was not stable. It flickered between symbols. It was an echo of a name spoken before language, a wound in thought. And it saw him. The spiral beneath his feet turned, not visibly, but in the way gravity shifts before a fall, and from within him something spoke, not aloud, but through him. "The gate has studied itself. The host is ready. The final spiral is not drawn. It is crossed." Ulrich fell, not from weakness, but from release. When he awoke, he was outside the chapel. The spiral drawings were gone. The book was closed. The bark was ash, and the sky had turned a pale, unnatural grey. Sister Thale found him sitting on the chapel steps, his hands open in his lap. "What did you do?" she asked. He looked up at her, tears dried on his cheeks. "I opened the last door. Did anything come through?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I went through." She stepped back, fear flickering in her eyes, but Ulrich only whispered, voice no longer shaking, "I know what Velmar is." And the wind, gentle and cold, carried his words into the empty square, not as a threat, but as a truth, one no longer waiting to be believed. The village of Fairholt, once modest and wary, now stood hollow beneath a sky that never seemed to change. The sun no longer rose with warmth, but with a dim metallic glow that painted the world in the tones of old parchment. Birds no longer came. The river, once lively and sharp with spring melt, now moved sluggishly, as if it too had begun to forget what it meant to flow. Ulrich wandered the empty paths between homes that no longer held light. He spoke little, but when he did, he spoke in spirals, not nonsense, not madness, but language folded inward, thought coiled into metaphor, truth delivered sideways. He still remembered how to speak plainly, but something in him had changed. Words had become weightier, some syllables tasted like ash, others felt sharp against his teeth. He chose his silence carefully now, not out of fear, but reverence. He knew too much. He had crossed the 7th spiral, and he had not returned alone. Sister Thale remained, though she rarely approached him. She watched from a distance, not with suspicion, but with sorrow. She prayed more often, even though the chapel itself had begun to warp. The floor groaned with every step, and sometimes the candles lit themselves when no one entered. The cross above the altar had split completely now, though no storm had come. She no longer asked him what he had seen, because she could see it in his eyes. a knowing, a stillness, and something else, barely perceptible, something watching through him. On the 5th day after the spiral had closed, a group of strangers arrived. They came on horseback, cloaked and armed, not villagers, not pilgrims. They bore no banners, but Ulrich recognized the look in their eyes. They were seekers. He met them outside the inn, where the sign still swung gently in the wind. The lead, a weeden with hair like coal and scars on her hands, dismounted and bowed her head. "Ulrich of Greystone Hollow," she said. His voice was soft. "I don't use that name anymore." "We were told you would know," she said, "that you had seen the 7th spiral." He nodded. "We followed the signs, the sleepwalkers, the drawings, the forgetting, all led here." "There's nothing here now," Ulrich replied. "Only what remains after understanding." She looked past him toward the chapel. Her companions stood quietly behind her, each holding strange instruments, iron rods, stone tablets etched in runes, vials filled with dark liquid. One of them, a pale man with pale eyes, asked, "Is it still speaking?" Ulrich smiled, a small sad thing. It never stopped. "They asked to see the book," he refused. They asked again, this time more firmly. He did not speak. Instead, he lifted a finger and pointed east, toward the hills, where the soil had begun to crack and spiral into itself, and where the trees grew twisted and inward-facing. "It's not in the book anymore," he said. "It's in the land." The woman stepped forward. "Do you understand what you've done?" He looked at her then, and for a moment his expression was that of the boy from Greystone Hollow, tired, searching, alone. "I thought I could understand it," he said. "I thought if I read far enough, studied deep enough, I could hold it, bind it, heal it." He paused. "But you can't bind a direction. You can't heal a path. Velmer isn't a thing. He's a tendency, a pressure, a tide moving backward through thought." The pale man whispered, "So it's true." Ulrich nodded. "I didn't find a presence. I found permission." And I said yes. The woman looked at her companions. "We need to act." "What will you do?" Ulrich asked, not mocking, but curious. "Seal the place, salt the grounds, burn the text, tear down the chapel." He gestured toward the chapel with a slow hand. "You can burn wood, you can scatter ashes, but can you unring a bell?" She hesitated. "Then we must try." That night they began their rites. They chanted in a language older than the soil. They carved runes into the chapel doors. They anointed the fields with oil and ash. They piled the book, the bark, and all copies of the spiral into a pyre and lit it before dawn. Ulrich stood beside Sister Thalia at the edge of the square. He watched the flames, he watched the faces of the strangers, and he said nothing. Because he knew. He knew that the spiral did not end on paper, it ended in thought. And thought had already travelled too far. By the time the strangers finished their work, the chapel was gone. Only scorched stone remained. The ground was salted, the walls torn down, the book burned to cinders. And yet, as they mounted their horses to leave, one of them, the youngest, paused. He stared at the ash on his boots, brow furrowed, mouth slightly open. Then he bent and, without thinking, began to trace something in the dust. A curve, a loop, a spiral. His leader pulled him back, alarmed, but it was too late. Ulrich watched from the hilltop as the wind carried the ash in slow, spiralling swirls into the air. The strangers left, but the spiral remained, smaller now, quieter, but patient, and Ulrich was its steward, not chosen, not cursed, just ready. Ulrich no longer marked time by sun or moon. Days passed, surely, but they folded into one another like pages turned too quickly, details blurring, only impressions remaining. The villagers who had stayed now spoke in hushed voices, eyes drawn to the horizon. They kept to their homes, not out of fear of plague, but of something more elusive, something with no scent, no sound, only presence. The chapel was gone. The book was ash. And yet, Fairholt still breathed beneath a sky that refused to return to blue. It remained that dim grey, like the world itself was caught between dreaming and waking. And in that space, Ulrich drifted. He did not eat often, nor sleep, but he did not weaken. The spiral had taught him how to persist in stillness. He wandered the edges of the village at dawn, where the fields had gone fallow and the birds no longer nested. He traced patterns in the soil with his boot, watching as the dust arranged itself, not as he directed, but as it willed. The land remembered. It remembered the shape, the rhythm, the curve. One morning he found Sister Thale sitting in the chapel ruins, her hands folded over her lap. He hadn't seen her enter. "You should go," he said quietly. She shook her head. I've nothing left beyond this place. I will not run from a shadow. It's no longer a shadow, he replied. It's light now. Just not the kind you want to see. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her gaze faltered. You speak like it's a god. Ulrich gave the faintest smile. No, not a god. He sat beside her on the blackened stone. Then what? She asked. He was quiet for a long while before answering. A memory. Thalie frowned. A memory of what? Of forgetting. She said nothing more. That night, Ulrich returned to the only standing structure that remained untouched, an old watchtower on the eastern edge of Fairholt. Built long before the village, it stood like a tooth in the landscape, weathered but steady. Inside he found a cold hearth, old beams covered in moss and carvings on the stone walls, circles and arrows and spirals worn nearly smooth. He lit a small fire, not for warmth, but as an anchor. Then he opened his satchel, not to retrieve anything, only to listen. The satchel was nearly empty now. The cloth scrap had crumbled. The bark strip had become brittle and dissolved days ago in his hands. But he kept the satchel because something within it still stirred when he drew near to places like this. Old places, forgotten places. Places Velmir might have once touched. As the fire crackled, Ulrich closed his eyes. He no longer dreamed in images. He dreamed in movements, in the rhythm of footsteps walking in circles, in the sound of a breath held too long, in the feel of ink sliding across skin instead of parchment. And that night he dreamed of stone. A room beneath the world. 7 doors, none of them open, yet all of them breathing. He stood in the centre, no longer himself, but still aware. His arms were bound in lines of script, his mouth sewn shut with gold thread. But his eyes saw everything. The doors were not meant to be opened, they were meant to be remembered. And Velmir, if that was still the name, was not behind them. Velmir was the doors. He awoke with blood on his fingertips. He'd been writing in his sleep. Not on paper, but on the stones, symbols in a spiral, scratched over and over until his nails cracked. When he rose, he left them untouched. He no longer feared what came through the spiral, he only feared what might never return. 2 days later, the strangers returned. Not all of them, only one, the pale man with the pale eyes. But they were not pale anymore. They were mirror smooth, like polished obsidian. He did not speak. He stood at the edge of Fairholt and waited until Ulrich came to him. Their silence was long, and when Ulrich finally broke it, it was with a question he had been avoiding since the beginning. Did you come to stop it? The man tilted his head. No, he said. That would be like trying to stop dawn. It does not arrive. It becomes. Then why return? The man reached into his cloak and pulled forth something wrapped in linen. He handed it to Ulrich. It was cold. Inside, a stone tablet, small Dutch with symbols, spirals, one more than before. Ulrich's fingers closed around it. I've been sent, the man said. By whom? The man smiled, and his teeth were no longer teeth, only polished stone. By what remembers? And then he turned and walked east into the fog. Ulrich stood in the empty street for a long time. The village behind him, the spiral ahead, and the world unravelling gently, not in violence, but in understanding, in invitation. And the voice within him whispered again, the final spiral was not the end. It was the key to the door you did not know you had already opened. And Ulrich, once a boy in the shadow of old woods, once an apprentice healer, once a student of wounds and reason, now understood what he had become. Not the answer, not the cure, but the reminder. Ulrich no longer felt the weight of his name. It was still spoken, occasionally, by the last villagers who dared to remain in Fairholt, by Sister Thalie in her solemn prayers, by the echoes of memory that passed like faint breezes through the blackened chapel ruins. But when he heard it, it felt distant, like an echo from a life that belonged to someone else, a name worn thin by time and meaning. The stone tablet left by the pale-eyed man sat on his table in the watchtower, untouched for 3 days. He did not need to read it to understand its contents. He felt them. It pulsed like a second heart, each spiral carved into it, thrumming softly when his hand passed nearby. The 8th spiral. New, unwritten in his book, unmentioned by the symbols. It had no title, only pressure. He stared at it as the hours bled into one another, listening to the wind speak through the tower's ancient cracks. He no longer looked for signs of sickness, not in the body, not in the air. Sickness had become irrelevant. The change now was subtler, more complete. He was no longer watching the spiral was watching through him. One evening, as the colourless sun sank behind the ridge and cast its long shadow over the hollow village, Sister Thale came to him. She climbed the tower without speaking, without being summoned. She simply appeared, as though she'd always been there, waiting for her moment to step forward. Auric turned as she entered. Her face was thinner, her eyes lined with fatigue, but her presence remained, firm, steady, tethered. "I had a dream," she said. Auric nodded, saying nothing. There were trees, blackened, with branches bent inward like hands, and in the clearing, a child digging. He closed his eyes. She continued. "I asked him what he was looking for." "What did he say?" Auric whispered. "That he was planting something." A long pause. "What?" Auric asked. She swallowed. "Himself." The candle between them flickered, though no wind had entered the tower. Sister Thale stepped closer, placing a folded cloth on the table beside the stone tablet. It was a shawl, small, a child's, woven in simple thread. "One of the children wandered east 2 nights ago," she said. "We searched, no tracks, no sound, just this." Auric stared at it. Another silence passed. Then she asked quietly, "Is this it then? The end of the story?" "No," he said. "The middle." Her voice cracked. "How can you be sure? Because endings are quiet, but this is growing louder." Thale lowered herself into the old wooden chair beside him, eyes never leaving the stone tablet. She reached out as if to touch it, then hesitated. "Will you follow it?" Auric's voice was calm. "I already did, but there's more." He nodded once. "The 8th spiral doesn't end," he said. "It becomes." Thale looked out the tower window toward the east. The hills there were darker now, less like land, more like memory congealed into shape. Trees grew at unnatural angles. Rocks had formed in spirals. Even the birds that passed overhead veered wide, wings faltering as they drew near. She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I was too," Auric said, "but that part of me fell away." "You mean died?" "No, I mean it stepped aside." Outside, the wind began to rise. It no longer sounded like wind. It sounded like a breath taken in the silence between words. That night, Auric descended from the tower. He passed through the centre of Fairholt, where only 6 homes still showed signs of life. He did not knock. He did not speak. He walked slowly, letting the air part around him like water. The villagers watched from slitted windows, some of them clutching symbols, crosses, charms, twisted loops of dried vine. But no one stopped him. No one dared. He reached the eastern path just as the stars began to emerge. But these stars did not twinkle as they once had. Some pulsed in tandem with the beat of his heart. Others drifted slowly as if unmoored from the sky. It was no longer the firmament of heaven. It was a ceiling of memory, cracking open. Auric crossed the field beyond the ridge, passing the last of the stone markers that once marked Fairholt's border. He stepped into the strange land beyond, where the soil was darker, where the grass no longer grew upright, where the ground remembered footsteps even before they were made. He walked for hours, never tiring. The stars above shifted, folding into unfamiliar constellations, shapes he'd seen in dreams, symbols he'd once tried to trace in ink, now burned across the heavens. And finally he came to the grove. It was not a forest, not fully, it was something between. Trees stood in spirals, each trunk leaning toward the centre of the clearing. At the very heart of it, a depression in the earth, no larger than a grave, but deeper than light could touch. Auric approached the edge, and there, carved into the soil, was the 9th spiral. He knelt beside it. He did not speak. He did not pray. He placed his hand into the hollow centre, and he remembered everything. Not just his life, not just Velmir, but the silence before language, the thought before self, the first wound of forgetting, the taste of lost names and the weight of shapes never drawn. The spiral did not pull him in, it simply opened, and Auric did not fall. He descended, willing, certain, and the earth, once still, turned inward with him. The 9th spiral had no name, because it did not need one. It was recognition made complete. And somewhere far above, in the grey village of Fairholt, Sister Thale wept beneath a hollow sky, whispering one final prayer not to God, but to memory itself. Fairholt grew quiet in Auric's absence. Not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of a place half forgotten by the world, like a room left untouched in a long-abandoned home. The air had changed. It no longer carried scent or warmth. Even the wind, once restless and curious, seemed reluctant to pass through. Sister Thale remained. She moved slowly through the village now, a lantern in one hand, her other brushing against door frames, stone, dried ivy, grounding herself in touch when her thoughts threatened to drift. The people who remained, perhaps a dozen, spoke in murmurs, though no one had fallen ill since Ulrich's departure. No spirals, no sleepwalkers, no more vanishings. But the silence was worse. It was the silence of something waiting. Each morning, she climbed the chapel ruins where only the foundation stones and a fragment of altar remained, and recited the rites she remembered. She had stopped speaking Ulrich's name. Not because she had forgotten, but because the name now echoed differently when said aloud, as if the syllables belonged to someone else, someone watching from the other side. The night sky had not returned to its proper place. The stars continued their slow rearrangement, forming constellations that had no legends, no stories, just spirals, curved lines and hollow circles that pulsed when stared at too long. The moon appeared only once every few nights, and when it did, it looked drawn rather than real, like something remembered imperfectly by a dreaming child. Then, on the 9th night after Ulrich's descent, something returned. Not him, but something of him. Sister Thale woke with the sense that she was no longer alone, not in her home, but in her thoughts. There, just beyond the veil of her dreams, she heard it. A rhythm. A heartbeat that wasn't hers. A voice, faint and impossibly familiar, whispering not words, but shapes. It didn't speak into her mind, it turned her memories into spiral paths and walked them from within. She lit a candle and walked to the eastern edge of the village, where the stones still remembered the boundary. Where the road had once led to green hills, now only ash-coloured grass grew. Grass that curled slightly inward like tiny hands folding in prayer. She stood for a long time, waiting. And then the earth sighed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even a sound, it was a shift, like the ground remembering how to breathe. From the soil beneath the horizon came a glow, faint at first, like dawn trapped beneath the surface. It pulsed once, then again, slowly. And with it came a shadow. It was not Ulrich, but it walked like him. It bore his height, his pace, even his stillness. But where his face had once carried the wariness of a healer, now there was serenity. The kind of serenity only the oldest stones possessed, or the ocean before a storm. The figure stopped at the edge of the field. It did not step into Fairholt. Thale stepped forward. Her voice trembled. "Is it you?" The figure tilted its head, and for just a moment she saw them. The eyes. Still Ulrich's in shape, but filled with spirals that turned inward endlessly, each reflection containing another. Depth beyond depth. He raised his hand. In his palm was a small, dark object. A seed, black as pitch, shaped like a spiral folded into itself. He placed it gently on the ground between them. Then he turned and walked back toward the grove. Thale did not follow. She fell to her knees, not in fear, not even in reverence, but in understanding. It was a gift, a fragment of what he had become, a reminder. She knelt there until dawn broke, thin and pale, spilling across the earth like diluted ink. When the villagers awoke, they found her still there, eyes open, hands folded, a strange calm upon her. She said only one thing. "He is not lost." She reached down, picked up the seed and wrapped it in a cloth. It was warm and pulsing. That evening, she planted it in the chapel ruins. No one questioned her. They gathered in silence, watching as she knelt and pressed the seed into the earth where the altar had once stood. No rites were spoken, no bells were rung. Only the wind moved, carrying the scent of ash and rain. And far beneath the soil, in roots that spiraled deeper than stone, something began to remember. The seed did not sprout, not in the way a flower does, nor a tree. Days passed, and the soil where Sister Thale had buried it remained undisturbed. No shoots broke the surface, no change marked the place where her hands had pressed it down, and yet everyone in Fairholt felt it. A hum, beneath their feet, beneath their thoughts. It was not constant, but it was rhythmic, a faint vibration that seemed to move with their own breathing. It came at night most clearly, when the wind stilled and the stars blinked slowly in their unnatural constellations. Some tried to ignore it, others pressed their ears to the floorboards, and a few began to hum along, unconsciously matching its tone, a slow and gentle frequency that never varied. Sister Thale kept watch from the chapel ruins, her hands folded, her eyes always half-lidded. She no longer slept in her cottage. Instead, she made a simple bed from woven reeds and wool beside the buried seed. The villagers brought her water, bread, dried fruit. She accepted it all with quiet gratitude. She did not ask for news, because she knew. On the 7th day after the planting, a child approached her in the early morning light. Barefoot, covered in dew, the boy did not speak. He simply pointed toward the chapel's stone foundation. There, where the altar once stood, a spiral had formed in the moss, not carved, not painted, grown, a perfect coil of living green, its edges curling inward like the unfolding of memory. Sister Thale bowed her head. It had begun. That evening the villagers gathered, not by request, not out of fear, but as if drawn, like embers pulled toward heat. They stood in a wide circle around the spiral moss. No one spoke, no one moved. The hum returned, stronger now, coming from below. Some placed their hands on the stones and felt it, a heartbeat, deep and slow, like the slumbering breath of something vast, old and kind. It was not terrifying, it was familiar. Thale stepped forward. She knelt beside the spiral and spoke her first words in 2 days. "He is growing," she whispered. Then she looked up at the stars, where a new pattern had begun to take shape, not sharp or spiraled, but curved and open, like a cradle made of starlight. One by one, the villagers knelt. Even the most sceptical among them, the blacksmith who had once cursed Ulrich's name, the widow who had whispered warnings of witchcraft, the boy who had drawn spirals in the dust and then forgotten his own name. All of them knelt and lowered their heads. The wind passed over them, warm and gentle. No words were spoken, but something was heard. Not by the ears, but deep inside the memory of each soul present, a voice, "You are not alone." And then the hum faded, replaced by silence, but it was no longer empty, it was full. In the days that followed, things began to grow in Fairholt, not wildly, not with sudden green miracles, but with a quiet steadiness. The river ran clear again, birds returned in cautious flocks, grass grew straighter and the trees lost their inward twist. A few villagers even laughed shyly as if remembering how. No new spirals appeared. No more wanderers came. The strange stars still hung overhead, but they no longer frightened. They were no longer symbols of warning, but of witness. And beneath the chapel ruins, where stone met soil and soil met something deeper, the seed pulsed gently, still warm, still waiting. Sister Thal spent her days beside it, writing in a small book. Not scripture, not prophecy, only memory. She wrote of Ulrich's birth, of Lever's teachings, of the fevered villages, of the monastery's descent, of Velmir's first whisper. She wrote of the 7th spiral, of the seed in the grove, of the pale-eyed man, and of the boy who walked into the east and did not return the same. She wrote of spirals, but she did not write the 8th or 9th. Those she knew were not hers to name. Those belonged to what lay beneath. And when she reached the final page, she paused. Then she wrote a single line. He was not the healer we hoped for. He was the wound we needed to remember. And she closed the book and placed it upon the moss. The book remained on the moss for 7 days, untouched. The villagers of Fairholt passed it in silence, each one sensing its presence, but never daring to disturb it. It did not gather dust. The wind did not turn its pages. Even the dew, which kissed every blade of grass each morning, seemed to avoid its surface. It simply was. A still thing, resting atop a living spiral, as though the spiral itself had grown to cradle the story, to preserve the memory, or to listen. Sister Thale kept vigil nearby. She had grown thinner. Her hair, once streaked with grey, now glistened with strands of silver like starlight woven into thread. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, not from weakness, but from reverence, as if every gesture might echo through something larger than time. One morning, just as it begun to lift from the hills, a shadow returned to the edge of the village. It came walking, not swiftly, not as a threat, but with purpose. A figure wrapped in travel-worn robes, a satchel at his side, his steps sinking softly into the ash-hardened earth. He bore no weapon, no book, only a thin staff etched with uneven lines that spiraled up its length. The villagers saw him from their windows. Some remembered, some wept, and one child, the boy who had once carved spirals into the chapel wall, ran barefoot into the square and stood before the man with wide, unblinking eyes. The man knelt, held out his hand, the child took it, and the hum returned. But it was different now, not beneath the ground, not behind the thoughts, but within the village, within them. It was the resonance of belonging, of memory shared and accepted, not as a curse, but as a root. The man led the child to the moss spiral. Sister Thalie stood waiting. Their eyes met. "Ulrich," she said. He inclined his head. "You came back." He smiled faintly. "I never left." She stepped forward slowly, reaching for his hand. He allowed it. And when their fingers touched, the spiral brightened. Not in light, but in presence, a soft exhale of meaning into the cool morning air. "I kept watch," she said. "I know. I wrote what I could." "You remembered," he replied. He knelt and placed his palm gently over the book. The moss shifted beneath him as though responding. A small breath of wind stirred the pages, and one turned, then another. Not by chance, by recognition. The book began to write itself. The villagers gathered again, slowly, reverently, forming a ring around the chapel's remains. No one spoke, no one cried. They watched as the final chapters of the story unfolded, inscribed not in ink, but in presence. In memory returned to soil, in truth returned to root. And as the pages turned, something grew from the centre of the spiral. Not quickly, not brightly, but with stillness. A shoot, black as shadow, curling upward, thin and precise, like a line drawn by a steady hand. A spiral in itself, unfolding leaf by leaf, not toward the sky, but inward. Its tip faced the earth as though bowing. Ulrich stood. "It remembers us now." Thalie looked at the growing stem. What will it become? He was silent for a long moment. Then, a place, a shrine? "A wound," he said, "a place that knows forgetting, a place where those who've lost something can be found again." The people began to understand. One by one, they came forward and placed things at the edge of the spiral. A doll's button, a withered ring, a page torn from a journal. Not offerings, not sacrifices, reminders, fragments of grief, of stories untold, of names once spoken. And the spiral accepted them. The shoot grew a little taller. Ulrich looked to the hills. Others would come. He knew this, not because they were called, but because they would remember what they didn't know they'd forgotten. He turned to Thalie. "Will you stay?" She smiled softly. "I already have." He nodded, and together they stepped aside, leaving the spiral unguarded, because it no longer needed guardians. It had roots, it had story, and from this point onward it would grow, not like a tree, not like a tale, but like a memory retold so often it became a truth greater than history. The 9th spiral was planted, but the 10th would belong to someone else. The 10th spiral did not come with fanfare. No lightning split the sky. No voice declared its arrival. It appeared first in a whisper, not spoken aloud, but felt in the space between thoughts where silence nests. It came as an understanding, not a symbol. A recognition that rippled gently through Fairholt, quiet and personal, as if each soul received it in its own secret language. And yet, somehow, everyone knew. The spiral had grown taller, still dark, still inward-facing, but its presence had changed. No longer merely a reminder, it had become a mirror. Those who knelt beside it said nothing afterward, but their eyes glistened differently. Some smiled through tears, some left tokens behind, some simply placed their palms upon the soft moss at its base and sat in silence until dusk. No one asked what they saw. No one needed to. Sister Thalie, now slower in movement but sharper in mind than she'd ever been, kept her vigil near the spiral. She no longer called it by name. It had transcended words. It was no longer his spiral. It was theirs. Ulrich came and went with the dawns and dusks, not always seen, but always felt. He would appear by a window or among the tall grasses or in the shadow of the tower's broken walls. Wherever he stood, people remembered. Not with pain, but with weight. The kind that steadies you, the kind that says you still are. On the 30th day after the seed was planted, the first traveller arrived. A woman. She came from the northern highlands, wearing furs and frost, her hair tangled by the wind. She bore no map, only a fragment of a dream she couldn't quite shake, of spirals carved in frost and a name she no longer remembered waking with. She entered Fairholt with the tentative steps of someone trespassing upon sacred ground. Thal greeted her with warmth, guiding her to the spiral without explanation. The woman approached it, knelt, touched it, and wept. She slept beneath the stars that night, curled beside the spiral, and when she woke she asked for a piece of soil to carry home. "So I won't forget," she said. It became a pattern. Each week, New figures emerged from the edges of the world, a farmer from the flooded southern valley who spoke only in riddles, a mute boy whose dreams were filled with songs from before he was born, an old monk with shaking hands and a faded spiral tattooed on his forearm. Each one came to remember, not who they were, but who they had once lost, a sibling, a lover, a name, a part of themselves that had gone missing without explanation, years or lifetimes ago, and each one left something behind. The base of the spiral became a garden of memory, tokens laid gently into the moss, a bone flute, a lock of grey hair, a strip of parchment with 3 words, "He forgave me." The spiral absorbed them without consuming. It held them, and it grew. Not in height, but in reach. The dreams began again, but they were different now, gentler. People dreamed of places they had never been, but always longed for. They walked long corridors of forgotten halls, only to find their childhood selves waiting at the end, arms outstretched. They sat beside fires with those they had once wronged or been wronged by, and felt the heavy weight of forgiveness settle across their shoulders, like a warm cloak. The spiral was not healing the world, it was reminding it how to heal itself. One day, Ulrich sat beside Thale again, just as he had in the days before. They watched the villagers in silence, some weaving garlands, some preparing meals for the travellers, some teaching children how to draw spirals in the soil. Thale turned to him. "Is this what it was always meant to be?" He nodded. "Not a warning, a route." She smiled, lines creasing around her eyes. "I think it always was. We just had to remember it that way." Ulrich stared at the spiral for a long moment. "It's beginning to speak a new shape." Thale tilted her head. "What kind?" "Not inward," he said. "Outward," she frowned. "A new spiral?" "Not exactly," he replied, his voice distant. "A branch, a continuation, something no longer bound to the ground, something shared." That night, the stars shimmered again, but this time a thin beam of light arced from the centre of the spiral toward the sky. Not blinding, not loud, just a single quiet thread of memory, ascending like smoke from a candle. Those who saw it did not fear. They followed it with their eyes until it vanished into the firmament, and in their chests they felt something shift, as if, for the first time, they were being remembered back. Ulrich stood at the edge of the chapel ruins, the wind stirring his cloak. He placed a hand over his heart, and for the first time in many, many years, he smiled. Not because the story was ending, but because it had finally learned how to continue. By the 41st day, Fairholt was no longer just a village. It had become a threshold. Travellers came not only from across valleys and ranges, but from cities where no stories of spirals had ever reached. And yet each arrival told the same tale. A dream, a whisper, a memory not theirs that pulled them gently toward this quiet place where time no longer pressed so hard upon the chest. The spiral, though still small, had deepened, not in form, but in effect. Standing near it was no longer a passive act. It asked something. Those who approached it unprepared would turn away in silence, weeping without understanding why. Others, trembling and wide-eyed, would reach out, touch its moss-bound root and fall into sleep as calm as still water, waking hours or days later altered. Not everyone stayed, but no one left unchanged. Children born in Fairholt after the planting were different. They didn't cry when they entered the world. They listened. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, not in fear but in strange understanding, as if they recognized something behind the veil of this world that others had forgotten. One child, the daughter of a widow who had once drawn chalk spirals during the fevered nights, was found one morning tracing lines in the dust that no one had taught her. They were not simple curves. They were sequences perfectly spaced, each stroke deliberate. When asked what she was drawing, she said softly, "It's the space between thoughts, the place where he left the key." They did not ask again. Fairholt Square became a meeting place not for markets, but for stories. Each night the villagers gathered, not around a fire, but around the spiral. They shared memories, not just of their own lives, but of dreams, of strange visions, of places they had never been, but knew. An old mason swore he'd once walked a spiral-shaped bridge that floated over a sea of starlight. A girl spoke of a woman with silver eyes who sang forgotten languages into stone. A hunter claimed to have followed a deer into a thicket that bloomed into a corridor of mirrors, and in every reflection he had worn a different name. Ulrich listened, always. He never led the stories. He never told his own. He didn't need to. He had become part of the spiral's root work. Not in body, not yet, but in essence. He moved through the village like the early light of morning, soft, unnoticed until it was gone. On the 61st day, a stranger arrived wearing robes woven from bark fibre and inked symbols. His face was veiled, his voice low. He knelt before the spiral without speaking, then drew a circle in the soil around it with powdered chalk. No one stopped him. No one asked his purpose. When he rose, he left behind a clay vessel sealed in wax, covered in the same markings. Sister Thale approached the vessel and opened it. Inside, a single fragment of wood, charred black, familiar. It had once been part of a door. She held it with both hands, tears pooling in her eyes. A piece of the monastery. Returned at last. She wrapped it in linen and placed it in the chapel foundation, beneath the spiral's outstretching tendrils. The moss reached for it before her hands had even released it. When she looked up, Ulrich was already gone. But she smiled. He had known it would come. Later that week, as the wind turned warm and the birds began to sing stranger songs in the trees, the spiral changed again. It opened. Not like a flower, not visibly, but in resonance. Those who approached it felt themselves seen, not judged, not measured, but witnessed. Their grief no longer stung as sharply. Their losses remained, but no longer defined them. Some wept simply from the relief of not being forgotten. On the 70th night, the sky shifted. The stars, which had danced quietly above for weeks, began to trace their own spiral paths across the heavens, a pattern so subtle it would be missed unless watched with care. But the children saw it first. They pointed skyward, drawing invisible loops with their fingers, and far off in the east, past the hills, past the grove where Ulrich had once vanished, a light pulsed once. Then again, it was not bright, but it was steady. Something was answering or remembering. Ulrich stood at the edge of the spiral's root shadow that night, watching the stars align. Sister Thale joined him, breath slow, hands clasped before her. "They're building something," she said. He nodded. Not with hands, with memory. He looked toward the east, with continuance. "What is it?" He smiled faintly. "A place for those who never had one." A silence passed between them. Then Thale asked, "Will you go?" Ulrich did not answer right away. He looked at the spiral, now wide, glowing faintly with moss-laced light. He looked at the tokens, the stories, the roots. He looked at the children playing nearby, drawing shapes in the dirt that had no name but made perfect sense. And then he looked at the stars. "Not yet," he whispered. "There is still one spiral left." Thale turned to him. "The 11th? He didn't nod. He didn't speak. But she saw it in his eyes. It would not be drawn in soil, or stone, or sky. It would be drawn in someone. When the world was ready, and the silence between thoughts had finally learned how to sing. The wind on the final morning was warm. Not the warmth of summer, nor the breath of a hearth, but the kind of warmth that comes from within, when sorrow softens into memory. Fairholt stirred slowly beneath a sky woven from silver clouds and the first golden light of dawn. The air held no tension. The birdsong was clear and deliberate, as if each note knew where it belonged. The spiral in the chapel ruins no longer pulsed. It no longer shimmered. It simply was. Complete. Its moss had thickened into a soft cradle of green and black. The tendrils coiled in harmonious arcs that extended just far enough to brush the edges of the stones where the altar had once stood. The artifacts surrounding it, fragments, tokens, offerings, had merged into the rootwork, not absorbed, held. You could still see the curve of a necklace, the page of a letter, the edge of a child's wooden toy. Nothing lost, nothing erased, only remembered. Ulrich stood at the edge of the foundation, a book in his hand, bound in pale bark, stitched in threads of silken vine. It was not the book he once carried. That one had burned. This one had grown. He had not spoken all morning, nor had anyone spoken to him. The villagers simply gathered in a slow, natural rhythm, drawn not by summons but by knowing. Sister Thale came last, her robe simple, her gait slow. Her hands no longer shook when they held the candle she'd relit for this moment. Ulrich opened the book. The pages were blank. And that, too, was right. He turned to the spiral, bent low, and pressed the book gently to its centre. Then he stepped back. The moss shifted beneath it. Not dramatically, not with spectacle, just enough to hold the book open, to its middle. A single tendril traced the fold between the pages, like a finger marking where the story had paused. Ulrich looked up to the gathered circle, to Sister Thale, to the children standing with wide eyes and dust on their cheeks, and he spoke softly so that even the wind leaned closer. The spirals were never maps, he said. They were voices. He turned slightly, letting the book remain behind him, open to the air. They began as warnings, then became remembrance, and now they are conversation. He paused. The spiral hummed once, just once, a single note, low and pure. Ulrich continued. We walked into the dark thinking it would consume us, but all it did was listen, and in our forgetting, something ancient was reminded. He placed a hand over his chest, and now it remembers us. The sky above shifted, not in colour but in shape. The clouds had spiralled subtly, looping around the eastern horizon, where that strange beacon had pulsed weeks before. Now it pulsed again, once, then twice. The children looked up and smiled. Ulrich stepped from the foundation and walked toward them, not as a teacher, not as a prophet, but as a man who had carried a question so far into silence that silence answered back. He knelt beside the youngest, a girl no older than 6, her hands covered in chalk dust. Do you know what the 11th spiral is? He asked gently. She blinked, then nodded. It's the first one you draw that no one tells you how to make. He smiled, and tears lined his eyes. Yes. He rose, and the villagers came to him one by one. Not to touch him, not to praise him, but to remember with him, to share what had once been too heavy and now was ready. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the roots of the spiral darkened into velvet shadow, Sister Thale sat alone beside the open book. A breeze turned one page forward. She read the blank space with a soft smile, then whispered, "Someone will write this part when they need it most." She closed her eyes. And for the first time in what felt like centuries, she rested. Far beyond the hills, beyond the groves and rivers, the world stirred. People dreamed of spirals again. But this time they were not afraid. They followed them. They drew them in margins of letters. They carved them into stones beside rivers. They traced them into the air above sleeping children, not as a warning, not as a wound, but as a welcome, because now they knew. The spiral was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of belonging. And Ulrich, boy of Greystone Hollow, seeker of causes, witness to Velmir, had not disappeared into myth. He had become what all stories long to become. A place, a memory, a name you whisper when the dark feels loudest, and you need something to remind you that you are still here, still whole, still held.